1 year ago today, Trump supporters from across the country gathered in the nation's capital to protest Congress's certification of the 2020 presidential election results.
To use a favorite term that all of you people really came up with, we will stop the steal.
At a rally near the White House, President Trump spoke to a crowd estimated in the thousands, everyone from ordinary Americans to conspiracy theorists to members of right-wing extremist groups.
We will never give up. We will never concede.
Trump repeated the lie that the election was stolen, urging his supporters to march to the Capitol and fight.
You'll never take back our country with weakness. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Around 1 p.m., as Trump is wrapping up his remarks in the park, the day turned violent. A group of his supporters on the western side of the Capitol confront the handful of police guarding the barriers and force their way through. Moments after Mr. Trump finished his more than hour-long speech, thousands of protesters streamed from that rally site and walked this route, down Pennsylvania Avenue, directly to the U.S. Capitol grounds. Several people told us that day they expected Vice President Pence to overturn the 2020 election results.
What needs to happen today is Vice President Pence needs to not open the 7 state electors' envelopes for the states that I mentioned. Set them aside and send it all back to those state legislatures.
Well, we got to stop this steal from happening because if we don't, nobody's ever going to vote again. There's not going to be any integrity in our voting systems.
As the crowd grows, clashes between Trump supporters and Capitol police officers, clearly outnumbered, intensified.
We're not going to take it anymore. This is our country.
Outside, the Capitol's west front became a battleground. Inside, the joint session of Congress to certify election results was underway. The traditionally ceremonial process is upended by Republicans, led by Representative Paul Gosar of Arizona and Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, challenging Trump's loss, sending lawmakers to their separate chambers to debate.
What does it say to the nearly half the country that believes this election was rigged if we vote not even to consider the claims of illegality and fraud in this election?
Meanwhile, around 2 p.m., the east side barricades are breached. Here's what I saw from outside the Capitol.
Half an hour ago, vehicle barriers that had been set up about 100 yards away or so from the Capitol were first breached by a group of protesters. Capitol Hill police retreated a little bit more. Then hundreds more protesters started to stream up this walkway in front of the Capitol. It is a remarkable scene.
On the west front, the mob tore down scaffolding, battled their way through the last line of police defense, and broke into the Capitol building itself. NewsHour congressional correspondent Lisa Desjardins was inside the building reporting live as it happened.
Judy, there are protesters. Protesters have now broken into the U.S. Capitol.
And it will stand in recess until the call of the chair.
The Senate was called into recess and evacuated. The mob of Trump supporters roamed the historic halls, damaging property and searching for lawmakers. Security footage captured the moment Capitol Police Officer Eugene Goodman shuttled Republican Senator Mitt Romney of Utah to safety before running ahead to divert the approaching mob away from the Senate chamber. Rioters came within 100 feet of Vice President Mike Pence, whose security detail took him to safety from an office near the Senate. While this was happening, at 2:24 p.m., Trump tweeted from the White House, criticizing Pence for not having, quote, the courage to do what should have been done. Remarkably, the House was still in session when rioters attempted to break into that chamber. A police officer shot Ashley Babbitt, an Air Force veteran from California and QAnon conspiracy theorist, as she and a crowd tried to break into the rear of the chamber where some lawmakers were still sheltering. According to an analysis from the New York Times, rioters breached the Capitol in at least 8 different places. They entered the Rotunda, Statuary Hall, and the Senate chamber. Some broke into the offices of lawmakers, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's. Law enforcement arrived to clear a hallway above Statuary Hall, where NewsHour correspondent Lisa Desjardins was sheltered.
But I do hear shouting as police seem to one by one be taking down the protesters, telling them to get on the ground. trying to control the situation.
Democratic Senator Patty Murray from Washington State spoke with Judy Woodruff about hiding in her office with her husband that day.
And we heard somebody saying, we saw them, they're in one of these rooms. And they were pounding on our door and trying to open it. And my husband sat with his foot against the door, praying that it would not break in.
Meanwhile, outside, as the crowds grew, so did the violence. Officers on site continued to call for backup throughout the day. And while some reinforcements did arrive from local and state and federal agencies, it took National Guard units about 3 hours to respond to the Capitol.
Rioters, outnumbering law enforcement by more than 50 to 1, attacked, dragged, and beat police officers, crushing them underfoot and spraying them with chemicals.
They began to beat me with their fists and with what felt like hard metal objects.
In testimony to Congress, former D.C. Metro Police officer Michael Fanone recounted being pulled into a crowd of protesters.
I was electrocuted again and again and again with a taser.
This is our capital!
In total, nearly 150 police officers were injured on the day. During the attack, those closest to President Trump privately urged him to take action and tell his supporters to stop the assault. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy spoke with him from the besieged Capitol. His son, Donald Trump Jr., and several Fox hosts texted White House contacts to tell Trump to address the crowd. Hours passed before President Trump did anything to address the insurrection. Just after 4 p.m., he released a video repeating unfounded claims about the election results.
I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace.
Around this time, police began to secure the Capitol. Flashbangs and tear gas were used to clear the Western Terrace, the site of presidential inaugurations. Police declared the Capitol complex secure around 8 p.m.
To those who wreaked havoc in our Capitol today, you did not win.
In the early hours of the next day, January 7th, Congress finished certifying the election results. Some Senate Republicans withdrew their initial objections.
The chair declares the joint session dissolved.
A Capitol police officer, Brian Sicknick, suffered 2 strokes and died that evening. In the days and months following the attack, 4 police officers who were on duty died by suicide. More than 720 people have been arrested and charged with crimes linked to January 6th. The physical destruction of that day has since been cleaned up, but questions of how to repair the deeper damage to our democracy remain. For the PBS NewsHour in Washington, I'm Amna Nawaz.
We are going to be examining what happened last January 6th, as well as the misinformation, extremism, and political divisions that contributed to the attack and continue to plague the nation to this day. William Brangham begins our coverage. He recently traveled to one part of the country that produced an outsized number of people charged in the Capitol riots, and heard from others in that community who are still trying to understand the forces that propelled their neighbors to the siege.
Any other patriots on the fence about joining us in D.C.? Don't think, just do.
They have reached up onto the terrace of the Capitol.
As TV screens showed the destruction and chaos at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, real estate agent Hava Johnston watched it all unfold on social media from her house in Frisco, Texas, as one Facebook friend after another posted from the Capitol.
Then when I started not only just recognizing names, but faces, and people that I've known for a long time.
Johnston worked in the same circles as Jenna Ryan, the notorious realtor who went to D.C. on a private jet and live-streamed on Facebook throughout the riot.
They said somebody in there is like shot in the face. I don't care. Shoot me in the face.
There's wonderful Jenna Ryan. That's the Frisco realtor.
Johnston had also been friends since high school with another local realtor who flew to D.C. with Jenna Ryan.
These were neighbors. A lot of them from right here in North Texas. We hang out together, we would go to happy hours together. It was shocking, but then when I took a step back and I started thinking a little bit more about who that person was, it was less surprising. I think that there is a certain section of these people that became emboldened and they feel righteous. And I believe that he is one of those that got swept up in that.
This region was an epicenter for people who went to the Capitol on January 6th. The Dallas FBI field office has arrested 35 people for their role in that day's events. That's among the highest numbers of any field office in the country.
When you saw that a lot of people in this region were being nabbed by the authorities for January 6th, did that surprise you?
No, it didn't. It didn't really surprise me. We have seen a pretty dramatic change and shift over the last 5 years. I think that politicians, somehow keyed into the idea that divisiveness and demonizing the other side created more of a frenzy.
How are you?
George Fuller is the mayor of the North Texas city of McKinney. He's pushed back on the various lies and conspiracies that animated so many people here to go to the Capitol. The main one, the repeatedly debunked fantasy that Donald Trump won the election.
And I'm here to tell you as a Republican, the election wasn't stolen. Republicans lost the presidency. And
is that a fraught thing for you to say aloud in front of a camera?
Oh, I will catch a tremendous amount of grief for that.
The mayor says it's not just the election. He's had to push back on all kinds of conspiracies in his community and even within his own family.
I have one sister that the fact that I was engaged in setting up a mega vaccination center, I was part of the deep state. I'm injecting people with tracking chips. I said, for you to be right, I have to be part of this conspiracy. And her response was, yeah, you are. You must be. I say it with a smile, but it's actually very sad. I was very close to my sister. But she finds, she spends her time in the deep black holes of the internet and finds all kinds of things that convince her she's right, and these things are real.
Those black holes and different realities are expanding as fast as these North Texas suburbs.
As you see around me, this area is going through a housing boom. According to the U.S. Census, the city of Frisco, Texas, was the fastest growing city in all of America over the last 10 years. And as this region grows, the demographics are shifting as well. This local county dropped from 63% white population down to 51% in that same time period.
Hi. Debbie teaches at a local public school. She asked that we only use her first name. She says, given the current atmosphere, she does not want to trigger any more anger. She's lived in this area for over 40 years, and she's seen some backlash to its rapid transformation.
We saw language about, keep Plano suburban and, keep away the apartments. I mean, that's a dog whistle, right? It's against diversity of people, of socioeconomics. It's just another culture war.
Others point out that nativist and at times violent rhetoric is also coming from the pulpits of some of the Christian evangelical churches in this area, like Brandon Burden, pastor of Kingdom Life Church, who told his congregants on January 10th it was God's will for Trump to stay in office and told them to keep their guns loaded. Debbie saw similar inflamed talk in the schools, in increasingly heated fights over mask mandates, so-called critical race theory, and growing calls for banning books.
We started the school year with tons of people showing up with signs and screaming with horrible things on their t-shirts and on these signs, and it's terrifying. They harass people.
Last year, Sodolph Hawk was the target of that kind of harassment. Her family is one of the many who moved to Frisco for the growing economic opportunities. But when she ran for city council in 2020, she saw an ugliness laying below Frisco's shining surface.
During my campaign, I started to face a lot of hate, misinformation, just brainwashing. The attacks that I got from different extremist groups trying to paint me as anti-Semitic, trying to paint me as, just anti-police, anti-American. Even at the polls, I was yelled at. I was spit at.
Huck lost her race and now says if she knew the extent of the xenophobia that would bubble out of some of her neighbors, she'd have thought twice before running.
I think if I had seen what went down on January 6th, if I had forecasted everything that happened leading up to November, I wouldn't have.
Really?
I wouldn't have.
It's a paradox. This region's booming development is quite literally built from the ground up and maintained by an influx of non-white residents and immigrants.
They do construction work, they do cleaning houses and roofing, electricians, everything to do with the building of a house.
Alex Camacho is a longtime pastor in McKinney and also a lawyer who helps immigrants work through the legal process. He says what he saw on January 6th turned his stomach.
For us, the American flag is a symbol of respect. When we become citizens, we pledge allegiance to the flag. But now that we see these rioters using the flag as a symbol and screaming and attacking people and destroying property of the government in Washington, we kind of, is that the purpose of the flag?
Meanwhile, rioters like Jenna Ryan seem to revel in their white privilege. She said, "Sorry, I have blonde hair, white skin, a great job, a great future, and I'm not going to jail." In fact, Ryan reported to prison right before Christmas for a 60-day sentence. Another January 6th rioter from North Texas, Mark Middleton, charged with assaulting D.C. police officers, is now running for a seat in the Texas legislature on a platform of building Trump's border wall, gun rights, and possible secession from the Union. And the big lie conspiracies continue. This county is one of 4 in Texas where officials have launched more audits of the 2020 election. Initial results, released on New Year's Eve, found what all other audits have found: no evidence of widespread voter fraud. For those who've borne the brunt of lies and conspiracies, this new year could not come soon enough.
There was a while where I couldn't even walk in my neighborhood because I wasn't ready to face the world. I mean, I'm raising 3 daughters. What kind of a world are we living in? How do we get out of it?
A year since the January 6th attacks, and the gulf between families, neighbors, and political parties seems wider and more unbridgeable than ever. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham in Collin County, Texas.
On January 6th, as rioters breached the Capitol's security perimeter, Capitol police officers tried pushing back the crowd in an attempt to protect the building and the lawmakers still inside. One of those officers was Brian Sicknick. Pro-Trump rioters sprayed him with a chemical substance during the insurrection. He collapsed later that evening. He suffered 2 strokes, and he died the next day at the age of 42. Officer Sicknick and Sandra Garza were together for 11 years, and she joins me now. Sandra Garza, thank you so much for joining us to talk about something so personal to you. Tell us a little bit about him.
Well, Brian was just one of the sweetest, kindest men I've ever met. And I know that sounds so cliche, when a loved one or someone that you care about so much passes away, for people to say, oh, they were the kindest, sweetest, person I've ever met. But it really was true. And I mean, to really emphasize how true that was about Brian, even the investigators who were investigating Brian's death, because it took, 3.5 months to find out what caused his death. They actually said to me that they could not find one person, not one single soul, to say anything negative about Brian. That's how well liked and how good of a person that he was. Brian got along with everybody. He was just a warm, loving person. And so it really hurt me a lot to know that he suffered greatly before his death. So,
and we know
he was a good person.
I know some people have looked at what happened, they've read a little about it, and they've questioned the connection between what happened to him. As we mentioned, he was sprayed with a chemical substance. Then he suffered 2 strokes. He died the next day. Some people have questioned the connection, but you've said there's no doubt in your mind that it was what happened in that riot that led to his death.
Well, I've said that I accepted the medical examiner's conclusion and their report. But what I will say is the medical examiner did say that all that transpired that day definitely played a role in kind of escalating or tipping the scales to escalate his death. And I agree with that, and I hope I'm not, misquoting the medical examiner. But, I mean, that's pretty much how I see it. You know, Brian was running from one end of the Capitol to the other end of the Capitol. He was exerting himself, and, he was attacked. All of those factors combined and being highly stressed, producing a lot of adrenaline and cortisol in the body, worrying about his colleagues as well as himself. I mean, I know if I was approached by thousands of people and there was only, 3 or 4 officers next to me and they're screaming at me and throwing things at me and assaulting me, I'd be pretty darn stressed. I think definitely that played a role in tipping the scales for him to pass away much faster.
Brian we know now, Brian had been a supporter of former President Trump. He had opposed his first impeachment. But then, of course, these events took place. Who do you hold responsible? To what extent do you hold the former president responsible for this?
I hold Donald Trump 100% responsible for what happened on January 6th, and all of the people that have enabled him that day and continue to enable him now. But definitely, yes. And I think, sadly, Brian did not live long enough to see the evidence that has come forth to show what kind of man Donald Trump really is. Clearly, he doesn't support law enforcement. I mean, he watched for hours law enforcement being pummeled and beaten, attacked, and he did nothing. Later, we had 4 officers killed themselves because of the events of that day, the stressors that they experienced. And of course, the last 2 officers, sadly, that committed suicide, we don't know all the factors that, combined that caused them to take their lives. But clearly, we know that January 6th was a terrible event. And I think that, coupled with maybe other stressors in their life, certainly played a role. And I think Brian would be horrified. I think he would have viewed Donald Trump in a very different light. And of course, on that day, all the officers were in their, respective areas. It was only after the event that they got to see all of the footage from that day, that they got to see what, their colleagues on the other end of the Capitol were experiencing. So I think they were horrified, yeah.
And you're right, it has taken a long time for many of those details, for the video, pieces of the story to come together. How do you think the former president should be held accountable?
Personally, for me, I think he needs to be in prison. That's what I think. But, Donald Trump has been playing these legal wrangling games for decades. He knows how to skirt the system. He knows how to, he's a very litigious person, himself. And then when he's been sued, he knows how to, play these games to get around things and avoid jail and prison time. So, that's the sad piece. But it would be very, what's the word I'm looking for? Satisfying to me to see him in prison. I don't regret for voting for Trump. I identify as an independent, by the way. Brian was a Republican. But, the horrific thing that he did on the 6th is unforgivable. And, it's terrible. Yeah, he's just a horrible person. And he still has not contacted me, by the way.
He has not been in touch with you?
No. He doesn't have the courage or the spine to do it. He just doesn't.
One other thing, what do you say to or think of the members of Congress? Most Republican members of Congress are saying, in effect, let's move on. January the 6th happened, it's in the past, we need to focus on the future.
Yeah, what I would say to that is Trump is the type of man who incites violence, and, you know, so it's not going to stop. And if they don't stand up and say enough is enough, it's just going to continue. And sadly, I really worry about the safety of our officers still. I worry about another January 6th like attack. I mean, this is serious stuff. And they're concerned about money in their pocket and power. It's ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. They don't care about the American people. That says it right there. They care about themselves.
Well, Sandra Garza, we know what a tough week this is for you, remembering all that, and remembering, of course, your longtime partner, Brian Sicknick. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Judy. I really appreciate you having me. It was nice speaking to you.
In the months since the riot, a number of far-right extremist groups have become household names. And as Nick Schifrin reports, some of their core beliefs and even their tactics have moved from the fringe to the mainstream.
On January 6th, in a sea of thousands of Trump supporters, members of the far-right group the Proud Boys descended on the National Mall. Among them, Matthew Green, who just a month earlier had joined the Central New York chapter. Law enforcement officials say Green and other Proud Boys, seen wearing earpieces, were among the first to barge through the police line. Last month, Green became the first Proud Boy to plead guilty to conspiracy, and he's cooperating with federal authorities who are attempting to untangle a complex web of planning and coordination.
I think you'd have to be naive to fail to understand how organized these groups were.
Michael German is a retired FBI special agent who focused on domestic terrorism. He sees January 6th as a culmination. Years of activity, from the deadly 2017 white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, to violent post-election protests in November 2020 that convinced these groups they could act with impunity.
These groups were increasingly emboldened to publicly announce their intention to commit violence at a public rally, commit violence at the public rally, walk away despite this criminal activity occurring in plain view. That created an atmosphere where they believed not just that they were going to get away with engaging in violence, but it was actually encouraged by law enforcement.
Law enforcement has cast a wide net, charging more than 700 rioters, including dozens from right-wing groups, the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and 3%ers. But the majority of those are not for violent acts such as assault.
The Justice Department's efforts seem to front-load people who were involved in the least egregious conduct. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of people engaging in violence against police officers. That should have been the primary focus, because many of those people still have yet to be charged and are out in the community, still able to organize, still able to attend events.
This year, across multiple states, Proud Boys have attended school board meetings to back those opposed to COVID measures and critical race theory, or CRT.
Anytime that there is a contentious issue, such as the mask mandate or CRT in our schools or forced vaccinations of our children, you're going to see more Proud Boys.
ProPublica reports at least 10 sitting state lawmakers are members of the militia group the Oath Keepers. Experts say an insurrectionist mentality is becoming normalized and more popular.
What we have is a new type of political movement with violence at its core. And what's new about the movement is that it's coming heavily from the mainstream.
Robert Pape is a University of Chicago political science professor and director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. His team studied those arrested for January 6th and found more than half are business owners or white-collar workers, including doctors, lawyers, and architects. Nearly 90% are not members of militia groups, and they come from 44 states, half from counties won by President Biden. Pape's surveys found 21 million Americans, 8%, called President Biden illegitimate and supported violence to overthrow the 2020 election.
We have a tinderbox in front of us. Think about this as a wildfire scenario where what I'm describing with the 21 million with these insurrectionist sentiments are the combustible dry wood that could be set off by a lightning strike or by a spark or by a match. And that combustible material is really quite significant at this point in time.
The problem of domestic terrorism has been metastasizing across the country for a long time now, and it's not going away anytime soon.
In March, FBI Director Christopher Wray told Congress the FBI had for years considered domestic terrorism as much of a threat as ISIS.
This is a top concern and remains so for the FBI.
In June, the Biden administration released the first national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, more information sharing inside and outside government, preventing extremist group recruitment, improving prosecution, and tackling endemic problems such as racism.
The only way to find sustainable solutions is not only to disrupt and deter, but also to address the root causes of violence.
And following a stand down to try and reduce extremism in the ranks, the Pentagon released a new strategy, including a ban on liking white nationalist or extremist social media content.
While extremist activity in the force is rare, any instance can have an outsized effect.
I think it's a good first step, but this is fundamentally a problem for our political leaders, our community leaders, our leaders of faith. We need to broaden our approach to this because it is a broader problem.
A broader problem as more Americans support and are willing to commit insurrectionist violence.
The political violence we have most to worry about today is coming rooted in the mainstream. That is a challenge. It's a challenge I believe that we'll be able to meet, but that's the core test of our democracy today.
So to explore how radicalization and extremism are testing our democracy, I'm joined by Kathleen Belew, professor of history at the University of Chicago and the author of Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, and Michael Jensen, a senior researcher at the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. Welcome to the NewsHour, both of you. Michael Jensen, let me start with you. Do you see more radicalization today than in the past? And is the speed of radicalization increasing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in many ways, January 6th was the culmination of things that have happened for at least 20 years in this country, and that really is the mainstreaming of radical political opinion. Certainly, the events of January 6th were tied to some of the extraordinary circumstances that we all endured during 2020, pandemic, racial justice protests, and a hotly contested election. But for decades, we've seen the surge in especially right-wing extremism in the United States. And is it moving faster? All indications are yes. This is something that primarily happens now online on social media, and social media is a hyper-mobilizing environment. It's a 24/7 echo chamber where individuals hear these views and are mobilized to act, so it absolutely is moving much faster today than in the past.
Kathleen Belew, the mainstreaming of radicalization, how are you seeing that into politics as well?
I think this is the critical question. We know that one stream of activism that took us to January 6th was the white power and militant right groups that have been active in our country since the late 1970s. But the big question is how they are able to recruit and radicalize from the other groups of people who were there that day. Things like the Trump base, QAnon groups, and even within Stop the Steal, there's a large degree of separation between people who came simply to a free speech action and people who came with the intent to do violence. And in the middle somewhere are people who were instantly radicalized on that day. So the question really is how that flow works between the extremist groups that are highly weaponized and highly organized and those mainstream people who are just now finding this ideology.
And Kathleen Belew, let me stay with you. Is it not only the flow, but is it also a question of what the goals are of these groups, of these people? Are the goals political or are they policy? Is it to sow distrust?
I think this is the big question. And my guess as a historian is that we really don't know the full answer here yet. Because earlier in the white power movement, part of the reason that these groups became violent and declared war on the federal government all the way back in 1983, and many of these groups have considered themselves at war on the state since then, is because they never thought mainstream politics could possibly deliver the kinds of reforms that they wanted to see. Mainstream politics, though, is not a closed door for many of these activists anymore, and some people are finding entry into our mainstream in all kinds of ways. This is something that would have been unthinkable to the people in the white power movement in the 1980s.
Michael Jensen, let me take us back to 2020 for a second, and a point you were making about what led to January 6th. We had unprecedented isolation thanks to COVID lockdowns, people spending a lot of time online. Then in the summer of 2020, widespread Black Lives Matter protests, and President Trump painting the election as an existential threat.
We are now in the process of defeating the radical left, the Marxists, the anarchists, the agitators, the looters, and people who, in many instances, have absolutely no clue what they are doing.
How did that rhetoric and those variables help lead to January 6th?
Well, January 6th was a product of having millions of people that were quite vulnerable to a radicalizing narrative. As you mentioned, these are people that were sitting at home, they were isolated, they were scared, they were anxious about what was happening around them and in their communities and in their lives, and they were looking for answers. And ultimately, they were spending an awful lot of time online looking for those answers. And in those spaces, they often encountered disinformation as much as they found truth and evidence. For mass radicalization, like we saw on January 6th, to occur, you have to have a narrator that is politically powerful and whose message carries weight. And nobody's message carries more weight than the President of the United States. So when the President says that the election was stolen, that's going to energize his base, and that ultimately mobilized thousands of people to act on his behalf on these unfounded claims that the election was stolen from him.
Kathleen Belew, let's fast forward to today and look at the two strategies that we've seen from the Biden administration. The Pentagon trying to tackle recruitment of active duty, but also veterans by extremist groups, and also the Biden administration with a counter domestic terrorism strategy, the first ever. What do you think of those efforts so far?
These are both very positive steps in the right direction. The DoD policy is particularly noteworthy because since the mid-1980s, the Pentagon has been trying to prohibit what it called active participation in extremist groups, but it did not define what active participation was or what an extremist group was. This new policy defines both of them, and the definition is broad enough that I think it would have limited several of the people who were involved on January 6th. It asks for service members even to take accountability for retweeting and reposting content from hate groups, and also sort of lays out a landscape of how we can begin to think about this problem.
Michael Jensen, you've talked about the need for mass de-radicalization. Are you seeing signs of a policy that can achieve that? Is it even possible to achieve that?
Yeah, when you look at the events of the past year, I actually think the Department of Justice has done quite a good job in terms of the criminal investigations tied to January 6th. It's the largest criminal prosecution in the history of the United States. But where we haven't done as good a job is tackling the disinformation that made its way into the mainstream in 2020. It's still very much front and center in our national political discourse. An overwhelming majority of Republican voters in particular believe that the 2020 election was ramped with fraud. We see anti-vaccination conspiracy theories, QAnon movement, et cetera, are still very much in the mainstream political discourse, and we haven't had a unified voice that's really come out to counter that disinformation. And I think really importantly is we haven't had a collective voice from both sides of the aisle of powerful political leaders condemning that disinformation and what happened on January 6th. And so unfortunately, if anything, we've moved in the opposite direction, because on top of all that disinformation, we now have this revisionist history around January 6th. Certain political commentators promoting the idea that it was a peaceful protest and that the truly aggressive people that day were the police, and that the demonstrators were just protecting themselves and they're true patriots. And so now we have this disinformation that's making its way into the mainstream on top of all the other disinformation that was there prior to January 6th.
Michael Jensen, Kathleen Belew, thank you very much.
Thank you.
As we know, police officers were on the front lines defending the United States Capitol on January 6th. For many of them, and even for the Capitol Police Force as a whole, the year since has been difficult. Lisa Desjardins begins there.
1 year later, some officers, like U.S. Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn, are still recovering from the emotional scars of that day. Others, like Capitol Police Sergeant Aquilino Gonell, are still recovering from the physical toll. Gonell recently tweeted out graphic photos showing the gashes and bruises from crushing and other injuries to his shoulder, to his hands, and to his foot. Dunn and Gonell co-wrote this op-ed today for the Washington Post, demanding accountability for the Capitol riot. Officer Harry Dunn and Sergeant Aquilino Gonell join me now. Thank you both so much for protecting the Capitol, me personally, and thank you for joining us now. And I want to start first off with that op-ed. You had strong words in that. One sentence that you wrote was this. You wrote, "It will not be enough to identify and punish only those who physically attacked the Capitol and tried to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power." Those are strong words. Sergeant Gonell, who do you mean there, and what do you want to happen in terms of that accountability?
Oh, there's a lot of people who are involved with what transpired on January 6th, including some of the elected officials that even after we put our bodies at risk of injuries and even death, like Officer Signey, they continue to downplay this tragic, horrific event of January 6th. And it's mind-boggling that what they do, trying to downplay everything.
It sounds like you're talking about politicians. Is that right? Being held more accountable.
Elected officials that on January 6th, on January 7th, they all knew where to put the blame and point the finger at. They all knew that the president for almost 3 hours did not do his job. And it pains me that 16 blocks away, he was watching everything on TV, despite the horrific images that were coming live on TV. I didn't see on TV, but I'm sure by then everybody around the country were watching it with their own eyes, as I was battling those people in the lower west entrance, or as people know it now, the tunnel.
You're talking about the former president, and former President Trump put out a statement just in the last few weeks calling what happened on January 6th an unarmed protest. Also, at one point, Officer Dunn, Fox News host Tucker Carlson, called you a, quote, angry left-wing activist. This is the battle now, a battle of words over what happened on January 6th. And Officer Dunn, I want to ask you, how do you respond to people who say that your accounts and the way people look at it are exaggerated and perhaps it wasn't that bad?
Well, thanks for having me on. Happy New Year to you. Angry left-wing activist. When I heard that, I had to stop and think about it for a little bit. It's fair to say I am angry. I'm a registered Democrat, so I guess I'm a left-wing. And if activist means somebody who's standing up for what's right and fighting for what they believe in, then sure, I'll be that. But outside of that, I don't have any response to him or anybody over at that network, because it just seems like they like to talk about people and not to people. So if they're interested in having an actual conversation about the facts about what happened that day, I'd be happy to talk to them. But until then, I'm just going to keep on talking to people that matter and fighting for accountability and justice for what happened that day.
If I may, you're talking about people who never raised their hand to say, hey, I don't solemnly swear to protect and defend this country and the Constitution. They never done that. So they are talking from their office and in comfort, despite us doing the hard work and protecting and serving something that they never thought about doing themselves, both as a police officer or as a military person.
You wrote in your op-ed that you feel there is an effort to whitewash what happened on January 6th. What do you mean by that, Officer Dunn?
You know, just a simple downplaying. Just like recently, I wasn't aware that what the former president's statement was that you just quoted. I wasn't aware of that statement, but I guess that's the perfect definition to the answer to your question about what they're trying to whitewash it and, an unarmed demonstration. I would like to refer to it as a terrorist attack. I went through it, and a lot of my coworkers physically hurt still to this day, 1 year later. And there's so much that we do not know about what happened that day. And we're starting to find out more and more about what happened that day. So I think we just need to continue to sit back and let all the facts come out. And it will no longer be people's opinions that are valid once all the facts are out on the table. So
I'm interested in talking to both of you. First, you, Sergeant Gonell, about why you think January 6th happened. You saw the faces of your fellow Americans attacking you. Why do you think, what was driving them? What's going on here, Sergeant?
During the last almost 5 years, we have an individual telling a lot of people, the system is rigged. If I lose, but if I win, it's okay. Everything is okay. And people are susceptible to lies. And the way that he was amplifying it made it even worse. Coupling that with the type of charges that some of these insurrectionists are getting, and people can see that as a way to explain it to themselves and say, you know what, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't as horrific as they saying, but it was horrific. If you were in that entrance to the Lower West Terrace, it was do or die. It was, these people were trying to hurt officer in fully clothed police uniform.
Officer Dunn, do you think this danger is still here? Where are we right now in terms of the threat to democracy from your view?
You know, it's scary to think about where we are. Like, sure, we succeeded as far as our mission that day. Democracy went on late in the night, January 6th into January 7th. Democracy prevailed. But I think it's very important for everybody now to realize how close and fragile democracy is, and that everybody, even anybody watching, anybody listening, has a job to do in protecting and defending democracy. That could be us police officers, we police. The legislators, the lawmakers, they need to do their job and legislate. The judges judge, and the American people need to vote about who to put into those positions. That we need accountability, and we need to make sure the right people are in office that want accountability also.
How's the police force doing? How is the U.S. Capitol Police Force doing? I know there have been improvements that they announced today, more equipment, but we also know that some 200 officers have left since January 6th. Recruiting is tough. Officer Dunn, how's the police force?
You know, I don't really want to speak for everybody else, so I'll just speak on some things that I know. We're still hurting. A lot of people are struggling with what happened. I'm still upset, but I'm recovering. I'm starting to heal, but I don't think total healing can happen until accountability has been had. So,
Sergeant Gonell, how are you doing?
I'm okay. I mean, there are days things comes in waves. It hit you left and right. There are times that I'm okay for a minute, then something, a word or a sound or a smell will trigger some of the things that happened back at work on that day. And going back to the question that you posed to Harry, the former president still wields a lot of influence over these people. And I'm worried that in the future, he could just tweet something or make a statement, and the same people who were on January 6, 2021, they could end up back at the Capitol. Yes, we have made a lot of improvement. Yes, we have a lot of training, but the forces that culminated on January 6, they're still in place, and that's why we need accountability. That's why we want to hold those responsible.
I know you both were facing the thick of the fighting, and we talk a lot about the difficulties of that day, but I also know you found some bright spots in the hundreds of letters and tweets of support. And I just have to thank you all for speaking to us tonight, Officers Harry Dunn and Sergeant Aquilino Gonell. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Happy New Year.
Just 3 days after being sworn in to serve his first term in Congress, Representative Peter Meijer, a Republican from Michigan, was among the lawmakers in the House chamber last January when pro-Trump rioters attacked the Capitol. He voted later with 9 other House Republicans to impeach then-President Donald Trump. That decision has resulted in death threats, and now he is facing a Trump-endorsed primary challenger as he runs for re-election. Congressman Peter Meijer joins us from Grand Rapids. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. As we said, you were in the House chamber on that day. What memories does it come back to you as you reflect on that?
I would thank you for having me tonight. I would say just feelings of anger, of frustration, of feeling like something sacred was being trampled on, and that, in the history that was made, a very dark possibility raised of the threat that every 4 years we would no longer have a peaceful transfer of power, but that we've just chosen to expand what we compete on in a political playing field outside of elections, outside of our institutions, and frankly put everything up for a debate.
As we mentioned, you were one of just a handful of Republicans to vote to impeach President Trump over inciting that riot. And we also mentioned death threats. You've had a reaction, very negative reaction from your constituents, even from family members. Are you able to have a rational discussion about what happened with any of these people?
Certainly on a one-on-one basis. I think oftentimes we'll find that the misunderstanding or where we differ is a lot less significant than it may appear from the outside, especially talking about the lack of response in the immediate hours after the Capitol was broken into. There's obviously people who still have very strong beliefs about the November 2020 presidential election, but when you start to get down to brass tacks and what actually occurred, clear away some of the fog, some of the deception and the misinformation that's out there, it's very hard to justify how the former president reacted, at the very least in the hours after the Capitol was attacked, when the vice president and the next 2 individuals in the presidential line of succession were under assault in the Capitol.
Well, I want to ask you about how you reconcile those views, because in a poll we've just done, only 10% of Republicans said they could call what happened on January 6th an insurrection. And then coupled with that, you have the great majority of Republicans who don't believe President Biden won. How do you explain these views, both of which are clearly not based on facts?
I think whenever you're asking a survey or a polling question, there's a certain defensiveness that can come in. I think I've seen that plenty of times where somebody will publicly be very defensive, and then on a one-on-one conversation, where the guards let down, where somebody doesn't feel like it's their tribe against another, they're more than willing to accept and acknowledge things. But when we have a highly polarized context, when it's black or white, when it's all or nothing, when we're dealing with absolutes, it's very tempting to feel like it's us versus them, when at the end of the day we're all Americans.
But 10% of the Republican Party members of the Republican Party saying they don't think it was an insurrection. I also want to ask you, Congressman, about you did an interview with NBC News over the weekend. You were asked about President Trump, whether there was another option for the Republican Party other than to support him, and you said there's no other option. I mean, what is it?
To clarify, when asked about why there was the reversion back after January 6th to supporting Donald Trump, I said because individuals did not see an alternative. They did not see another path. Not that there is no choice, but that we need to be creating the path. We need to be working on what a party that is reflective of the concerns of conservative Americans, but that also is a party that adheres to the rule of law, what that looks like. And to me, that is a charge. That is an opportunity to be defining that, not succumbing to a belief that there is no other option, but that the charge is to create it. And just to clarify on that poll, that only 10% of Republicans described it as an insurrection, I think the other options were a protest or a riot. And I think riot was 30%, and I think protest was 40%, if I'm referencing the same poll.
But I think it's clear that you, and you're listening to the police officers we just heard from, there's no doubt in there, or at least what came across is they believe this was an attempt to overthrow the results of the election. Congressman, you didn't vote for this January 6th committee in the House. You've said that you want to wait and see what the work product is, but I did interview yesterday the longtime partner of Brian Sicknick, who was the Capitol police officer who died the day after the attack on the Capitol. And she said unless members of Congress, including Republicans, are able to hold President Trump accountable, there's going to be more violence. What do you say to Sandra Garza, who, again, longtime partner of Brian Sicknick?
I say we absolutely have the same fears, that I grieve for the tragedy that struck her and her family in those moments. I mean, the loss of Officer Sicknick, and then the subsequent loss of several other Capitol police officers and Metropolitan police officers who took their own lives in the days and weeks and months that followed is an absolute tragedy, and why it is even more frustrating to see people whitewash and downplay the events of January 6th. We have to face it for what it was. We have to recognize the threat of political violence and say that we should not be tolerating that. That was one of the reasons why I voted for impeachment. The fact that we cannot, in our political system, be playing around with such dangerous rhetoric and encouraging, spurring, inciting people to go and try to use force, use threats, use violence in order to achieve a political end. That cannot be tolerated in our politics. But I would say, sorry.
Excuse me, I was just going to say, but the leadership of your party in the House and the majority of Republican members of the House are saying that this committee shouldn't be there, it shouldn't be doing this work, that it's important to look ahead, not to look back. In other words, it's just the opposite of what these police officers and what Ms. Garza are calling for.
And there were dozens of my Republican colleagues who voted in support of a bipartisan independent commission that was styled after the 9/11 commission. And I think I'm still deeply disappointed and frustrated that commission was not formed. Again, I said that I will look at the work product and the results coming out of the January 6th Select Committee, as it continues along. But in my mind, the opportunity that was missed, and I hope that the ultimate work product will be this, was to have something that could be looked at and viewed objectively by the American people, that can be clearing away a lot of, again, the rumors and the innuendo and the deception and the misinformation, the whitewashing, the blame casting that we saw in the days, weeks, and months after January 6th, and still, today trying to make it seem like anything other than it was, which was a violent attempt to interfere with the proceedings of Congress, and specifically the certification of the Electoral College results.
And we're hearing your voice, a minority voice in the Republican Party. Congressman Peter Meijer, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
1 year ago this week, crowds stormed the U.S. Capitol while lawmakers were inside affirming the results of the presidential election. We have two different views on the events of January 6th from lawmakers on opposite sides of the aisle who were both at the Capitol that day. Lisa Desjardins begins our coverage.
And now I'm joined by Troy Nehls, a Republican congressman from Texas, also a former sheriff and combat veteran. Thank you for your service, and thank you for talking to us today. I know on January 6th, you were there with a chair leg in your arms at the door to the House chamber to keep rioters out. I wonder how you reflect. What do you think happened on January 6th? How do you see it?
Well, actually, thank you, Lisa, for having me. It actually was a hand sanitizer. It was a wooden hand sanitizer. I was at the back doors, the center doors leading into, obviously, the House chamber. Those doors would be the same doors a president would walk through when he would deliver a State of the Union. And I was positioned back at those doors. And obviously, once we're going through the objectors in Arizona, the state of Arizona was there. And then all of a sudden, several uniformed personnel in plain clothes. Obviously, the plain clothes rushed Nancy off the dais back there and rushed her back into her speaker's lobby. But the doors started shaking violently. I mean, the doors were locked, but people were banging on those doors, and Capitol Police were there. I was told by one of them that I must leave, and I chose not to. I said, I am not leaving. I'm going to sit there, and I'm going to be there with my brothers and sisters in blue. And the doors kept shaking violently. You could hear the commotion on the other side. And then you can see in some of the photos that furniture was brought over to help secure those doors. But there was these wooden hand sanitizers, and Mark Wayne Mullen, another member of Congress, was there, and he broke off that hand sanitizer off that wooden base, and there was another one there, and I did the same thing. So that was my weapon for the day. Should those individuals be successful in getting through those doors. And thank goodness they weren't.
I know that you've called what happened criminal. You have been very clear in saying that it was dangerous. Those who incited violence were wrong. But there is a real divide over the narrative about January 6th, and there's a real divide over the role of President Trump, the former president, who I know you support. I wonder, how do you see his role that day?
Well, let's go back to the individuals that you mentioned. I use the word criminal, and yes, there were individuals inside that Capitol building that day that committed assault on police officers, and some of those assaults even being aggravated. If you were inside the Capitol that day and you broke windows and you destroyed property, you should be held accountable. If you assaulted a law enforcement officer, you shouldn't just go to jail, you should go to prison. And I think most of the American people agree with that when you were in there and you were committing criminal violations of the law, assaults, destruction of property, breaking the windows, you should be held fully accountable for your actions that day. But what we do know is there were many people inside that Capitol building that day that were not doing any of those things. They weren't touching anybody. They weren't assaulting anybody. They were walking around inside that Capitol building. Many of them were grandmas. Many of them almost appeared to be ushered in. And so their only crime that a majority of the people inside that building, the people that entered that building, I guess the only crime was maybe entering the building. And many of them, quite honestly, didn't even realize that they were committing a violation of the law. That is the United States Capitol. It's open to citizens, and it's the country's building. So I kind of question some of the motives of the DOJ. And others who are claiming that every person inside that building is an insurrectionist. That term gets to be used quite a bit by the liberal media, but nobody has obviously ever been charged with insurrection. So I pause as it relates to the 700 or so individuals that have been arrested by the FBI and the DOJ as they're related to their activities on that day.
I gotta check your language. I heard you say that it seemed some of them were ushered in. I didn't see anyone ushered in. I saw people breaking in. I also want to come back to the former President Trump. At 4 o'clock on January 6th, you wrote this tweet after seeing what you did. You wrote, "What I'm witnessing is a disgrace. Violence is never the answer." A strong tweet from you. But at that moment, as of that time, President Trump still had not told the rioters to go home. And we know there were many, many Trump supporters in that crowd, if not the majority of the crowd from my experience. Did he do enough? What do you think his role was that day?
Well, I'm not in Donald Trump's head. I wasn't in the Oval Office or wherever he was positioned that day, and I wasn't one of his top advisors. So I don't know. I mean, could he have maybe said something?
But he's he was our president.
Maybe.
But I have to say, he was our president, a Republican. You support him.
But you alluded to earlier about when I made the comment about being ushered in. Nobody on this select committee, and it's Pelosi's select committee. Benny Thompson is the puppet, and she is the puppet master. You want to claim that it's bipartisan. When you look at bipartisan, Miss Cheney and Kinzinger are Pelosi Republicans. Kinzinger isn't running again, and obviously Liz Cheney is going to be defeated here in 2022. But that entire committee, they all have one thing in common. They hate Donald Trump. They despise him. They talk about him all the time, and I kind of joke that they have a serious crush on this guy. They have a serious crush on Donald Trump because that's all they want to talk about. What they want to do is blame Donald Trump for January 6th with everything. They want to go after all of his associates. They could do contempt of Congress against Bannon, and then it was Mark Meadows. But nobody on this committee is asking the real difficult questions, the questions that the American people need to know about, and that is why were the Capitol Police so ill-prepared to deal with that day?
how do we move forward? How do you think we get past the divide in the country? In just a sentence or two.
That's a very difficult question. I think our country overall lacks faith. I think we need to get back to basic principles, and we're losing faith as a country. But there is that divide, unfortunately. I went to Joe Biden's inauguration on January 20th, and he got up there and he said that he would work with his friends on the other side of the aisle. And quite honestly, as a member that's been there for 12 months, I haven't seen any of it. I haven't seen any of it. Joe Biden despises President Trump. He completely reversed his immigration policies. He completely reversed all these other things. So there is a divided country, and we must do better than that. We owe it to the American people to come together. But right now, you just don't see it. I certainly don't see it from this administration.
Congressman Troy Nehls, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless.
With few exceptions, members of the two political parties view January 6th very differently. For a Democrats' take now, we are joined by the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus. He is Representative Hakeem Jeffries of New York. Congressman Jeffries, thank you very much for being with us. I believe you heard at least part of what Congressman Nehls was saying, but I want to ask you, you were on the floor of the House on January 6th. What memory do you take away from that day?
Well, what took place on January 6th was a violent attack on the Congress, the Capitol, and the Constitution, and it was, of course, incited by the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, who, for several months prior to January 6th, had perpetrated the big lie that he actually won the election and that it was stolen from him. He radicalized millions of people across the country, and some of them showed up on January 6th intent on effectively overthrowing the government and trying to halt the peaceful transfer of power. It's a day like Pearl Harbor and like Bloody Sunday down in Selma, Alabama, and like September 11th that should live in infamy here in America and throughout the world.
As we said, you were there on the floor. How close did it come to being even worse than it was? Ultimately, these rioters were not able to get into the House chamber. They did get into the Senate. But from your perspective, how close did we come?
We came very close. I recall the Sergeant-at-Arms interrupting the debate that was underway with respect to the results in Arizona. And he said something that I can remember as vividly as if it was said just today, when he said, "The mob has breached the Capitol. They're on the second floor. They're a few steps outside of the House chamber. Be prepared to hit the floor and secure the gas masks that are underneath your seats." I'd been in Congress at that point for 8 years, never did I have any real understanding that there were gas masks in the House chambers, let alone would have to utilize them one day. And thankfully, at some point, the Capitol Police found an escape route, and they were able to safely evacuate members of Congress. But many of us at that particular time thought we were actually going to have to fight for our lives.
And when we heard Congressman Nehls refer to some people or many people, in his words, being ushered in to the building, did you witness that in any way?
Yeah, the Capitol was violated. Folks urinated, they desecrated the citadel of our democracy. This fantasy and fiction that, for many people it was all wine and roses is after the fact spin. That's why the bipartisan January 6th Select Committee is so important in uncovering the truth, presenting it to the American people in terms of what happened, why it happened that day, and also coming forward with some recommendations as to how to prevent that type of violent attack and assault on our democracy from ever happening again. And Judy, let me make this one point about the Democratic and Republican members of the Select Committee, Chairman Benny Thompson, Vice Chair Liz Cheney, they're doing a great job. No member of that committee hates Donald Trump. But they do love democracy. They do love America. We all do. We do love the peaceful transfer of power. And that's why we're committed to uncovering the truth.
And you've spoken about how, in fact, Congresswoman Cheney approached you, even as the assault on the Capitol was taking place, spoke to you about how to hold President Trump accountable. As you point out, Congressman Kinzinger, now serving on that committee. They are, though, very much tiny minority in their party. Have any Republicans in the House spoken to you privately, reflecting any views differently from what we're hearing from the Republican leadership in the House?
Well, the Republican leadership has completely abdicated any responsibility in the context of ensuring that the events around January 6th never happen again, and that they shouldn't be looked at through a partisan lens, because that was an American tragedy. Now, there are dozens of House Republicans that did fortunately vote to certify the election of Joe Biden, and I do have conversations with many of them. They did the right thing that night, and hopefully they will continue to try and do the right thing and stand up to the efforts by Donald Trump and his authoritarian co-conspirators to really obliterate American democracy, which would not be good for anyone, not good for Democrats, not good for Republicans, not good for independents, not good for America.
But do you think there are more than the 10 who voted to impeach him later? I mean, are we looking at a situation where there may be more, I don't know, closet Republicans who are prepared to stand up, or is what you see what there is?
Well, it's my hope that that Republicans of goodwill, beyond Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and those who voted to hold Donald Trump accountable for inciting that violent insurrection through their impeachment vote, will stand up and reclaim their party. Because right now the Republicans are not the party of Ronald Reagan, they're not the party of John McCain, they're not the party of Bob Dole or George H.W. Bush or George W. Bush. They're not even the party of Mitt Romney. You know, they are the party of Donald Trump and a violent insurrection. Take your party back for the good of America.
Congressman, I want to turn to something that has grown out of what happened that day, and of course to challenge the election. That's the effort by Democrats to get voting rights reform legislation passed. Up until now, no Republicans have, at least in the Senate, have expressed a willingness to do this. But just in the last few days, we're hearing from some Republicans that that they might be willing to look at the way the electoral vote is counted instead of voting rights reform. Is that something that you think could be acceptable?
Well, it's not an either-or situation. We have to do both. The right to vote is sacred to the integrity of our democracy. This principle of one person, one vote, and government of the people, by the people, and for the people is really brought to life by every single American being able to exercise their franchise, choosing who represents them at all levels of government. And so we've got to elevate that, because we have a voter suppression epidemic that is taking place all across the country. And the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act are critical in making sure we push back against that. At the same time, this principle of the peaceful transfer of power, which is central to American democracy, Republican presidents handing off to Democratic presidents and vice versa, that was interrupted and almost disrupted permanently on January 6th. And reforming the Electoral Count Vote Act is an important thing that should be done to tighten up some loose ends that exist right now in that peaceful transfer of power.
Congressman, in the time we have left, it is a political year, midterm elections coming in November. It doesn't look like a good year at this point for Democrats for historical reasons and others. Right now, is there one thing, what would you like to see President Biden do that could help the Democratic prospects this November?
Well, President Biden is doing a great job in making sure that we confront the COVID crisis anchored in science and evidence in a decisive fashion, and he'll continue to lead in that way. At the same time, deal with the economic challenges that we confront, inflation, continue to create millions of good-paying jobs, and then we'll have to sell the American people on what we've done, and we'll be able to do that, particularly when we get the Build Back Better Act over the finish line.
But my question is, how confident are you that can happen given opposition in your own party in the Senate?
Well, I'm very confident. You know, we're not a cult, we're a coalition, and so we have to work with the various components of that coalition, including Senators Manchin and Sinema. I believe President Biden, who knows the Senate better than perhaps any president in modern American history, he'll get it done.
Are you prepared to see big changes, though, in the Build Back Better bill, as it is, for example, cutting in half the threshold household income amount for the child tax credit?
Well, the tax cut for children and families through the child tax credit has been transformational for working families, low-income families, and middle-class families, and I think we have to continue to keep it robust. But let's have a conversation and see what Senator Manchin comes up with. At the end of the day, we need a product that decisively makes life better for everyday Americans, and if we get that product, it's something I can live with.
So maybe something below $400,000 household income. Just finally, Congressman Jeffries, we know Speaker Pelosi has said she does intend to serve through the remainder of this term, but if she decides not to run for leadership again, are you going to run for your party's top position in the House?
Well, I've got a job to do as chair of the House Democratic Caucus, and I also have to go back to the voters to try to get my 2-year employment contract renewed in 2022. So I'm going to keep the focus on that for the moment.
We will leave it there. Representative Hakeem Jeffries of New York, the chair of the Democratic Caucus, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The attack on the U.S. Capitol nearly 1 year ago was based on a big lie about election fraud in 2020 and the hope of supporters for former President Trump that they could stop the certification of electoral vote results. But starting that day, there has been a new misinformation campaign to recast, downplay, and misrepresent the events that unfolded at the Capitol. Amna Nawaz reports.
They broke through barricades, assaulted police, smashed their way into the Capitol, and sent lawmakers into hiding. Yet even as the attack was playing out, there were already alternative narratives being spun about who was to blame.
There are some reports that Antifa sympathizers may have been sprinkled throughout the crowd.
Possibly Antifa insurrectionists possibly could have infiltrated some of these movements and maybe instigated some of this.
The Washington Times has just reported some pretty compelling evidence from a facial recognition company showing that some of the people who breached the Capitol today were not Trump supporters. They were masquerading as Trump supporters and, in fact, were members of the violent terrorist group Antifa.
Yeah, in the first hours and days afterward, you could see Trump and his allies and supporters sort of groping for what the appropriate narrative was.
David Graham is a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
So on the one hand, you had Trump, coming out with his video on the day of saying, "We love you, but now go home." But you also saw people saying, "Oh, this is agitators, it was Antifa, it was Black Lives Matter."
That despite contemporaneous texts between pundits on Fox and the White House showing they thought Trump supporters were responsible. When subsequent arrests confirmed that publicly, the narrative on the right shifted to downplay the violence that day. Here's former President Trump on Fox in March.
Right from the start, it was zero threat. Look, they went in, they shouldn't have done it. Some of them went in and they're hugging and kissing the police and the guards.
There was no insurrection, and to call it an insurrection, in my opinion, is a bold-faced lie.
Republican Congressman Andrew Clyde at a hearing in May.
If you didn't know the TV footage was a video from January the 6th, you would actually think it was a normal tourist visit.
I mean, it's strange to see somebody like, Congressman Andrew Clyde, of Georgia, who we saw in videos and footage from January 6th, helping to bar the doors, suddenly saying, well, these were just tourists, they were walking through.
Another recurrent theme, shifting focus away from January 6th and towards protests for Black Lives Matter the year before. Republican Congressman Clay Higgins of Louisiana.
19 people died during BLM riots last year. Hundreds and hundreds were injured. 2,000 police officers were injured from BLM riots last year.
Voices on the right have also recast those awaiting trial for their part in the attack as political prisoners. Here's Republican Congressman Paul Gosar of Arizona last month.
These are dads, brothers, veterans, teachers. All political prisoners who continue to be persecuted and endure the pain of unjust suffering.
So too with the death of Ashley Babbitt, the Air Force veteran shot by Capitol Police as she attempted to breach the Speaker's lobby. Here's Republican Representative Jody Hice of Georgia in May.
In fact, it was Trump supporters who lost their lives that day, not Trump supporters who were taking the lives of others.
Former President Trump reinforced that in a July interview on Fox.
Who was the person that shot an innocent, wonderful, incredible woman, a military woman?
The idea that they were all motivated by these good intentions. They believed the election was stolen, which of course was false. It was a lie that had been peddled to them by the president and many of his allies. But they were going in and they wanted to stand up for what was right. That they were sort of like the American revolutionaries or like, the Confederate rebels who wanted to really uphold the best of the Constitution.
In an October piece in The Atlantic, Graham explored this idea, how those who committed criminal acts to stop a democratic process have been recast by the far right as heroes, patriots, and martyrs for a just cause, much like the Confederate soldiers celebrated by the mythology of the lost cause.
The fact that those people are referred to by some in these circles as patriots, what does that do to the narrative?
It makes them into the heirs of what was right. It turns something that was one of the darker moments in American history into one of the brighter ones, into a moment of unity and rebellion against what's wrong and standing up for what's right, which I think is really dangerous. If we can turn something that's an assault on a constitutional process into a moment of triumph and a moment of a sort of lodestar for what's to come, I think that doesn't bode well for American democracy.
These efforts could be working. An NPR NewsHour Marist poll conducted last month showed a sharp partisan divide over how Americans view what happened on January 6th, the legitimacy of investigations into it, and decreasing blame for President Trump, even as the former president continues to push the lie at the heart of January 6th.
The durability of that lie, where does that fit into sort of the larger misinformation campaign, the very thing that brought people out on January 6th in the first place?
Well, it's essential to the legitimacy of Trump as a political actor today. If he's somebody who had the election stolen from him, that makes him still a sort of heroic figure and a more legitimate leader, perhaps, than Joe Biden in the eyes of his supporters. And that enables a lot of other information.
Information, or more accurately, misinformation, questioning or undermining everything from measures to stop the spread of COVID-19 to the safety and efficacy of vaccines, from bogus stories about vaccines tracking and controlling Americans to campaigns to stop teachers from talking about race or racism in schools.
So when people in the Trumpist orbit spread misinformation about Joe Biden, or they spread misinformation about vaccines or about COVID, all of these spring from his legitimacy as, the real elected leader, which depends on the lie of the election being stolen.
For more on the misinformation surrounding January 6th and how it spread and evolved, I'm joined by two people who track and study just that. Jennifer Kavanaugh is a senior political strategist at the RAND Corporation. She co-authored the book Truth Decay about the rise of misinformation. And Claire Wardle is the U.S. director of First Draft. That's a nonprofit that tracks misinformation online. Welcome to you both, and thank you for being here. Claire, I'll begin with you. As we just saw immediately after the Capitol attack, there were already alternative narratives being spun despite live pictures, live reports, people seeing it in real time. In our latest NewsHour NPR Marist poll, it shows a divide on how Americans saw that day. 89% of Democrats say January 6th was an insurrection, was a threat to democracy, but only 10% of Republicans agree with that. How does that happen, Claire?
Because there was a foundation being laid all the way through 2020, and then from Election Day onwards, this stop the steal narrative was emerging, this idea that the election was not safe, that the election was stolen. There was this drip, drip, drip throughout November and December. And so when we had the events of January 6th, very quickly, very smart people began shaping these narratives that already had a foundation that made sense to people who wanted to believe a certain worldview.
Jennifer, talk to me about the role of news and journalism in all this, because you have studied this, about the declining trust in news, American skepticism around news. How much do you think that contributed to people being willing to say, what you're reporting, what you're showing me, I don't believe?
I think it played a big role. I mean, people get their information from specific sources. And when they see information coming to them from sources that they don't trust, they tend to discard that information. It's also really hard to change people's minds once they've made it up. So when people see additional information coming at them that contradicts that, they're not ready to discard what they've been believing for months or what they've been hearing from their trusted figures. The fact that people have such low trust in media plays a big role in their lack of ability to change their mind. And the difficulty that we face in trying to spread accurate information after the fact.
And Claire, we know one of the main ways in which that information was spread, even well before the Capitol attack, was on social media, right? We saw even leading up to that day, the whole Stop the Steal narrative, how those groups not only organized online, but then mobilized online, got people to show up in real life to commit criminal acts after that organization. What responsibility lies with the companies behind those social media platforms?
When you look back at the timeline, it was only September of 2020 when Twitter started marking as false tweets from the president, for example, saying that the votes couldn't be trusted. So I think the platforms weren't ready for this. And then as we saw on essentially January 7th and 8th, they panicked, and like dominoes, they all started changing their policies and deplatforming. But the disinformation ecosystem is really participatory and engaging. And that's what's happening on these platforms. Not that much has changed in a year. And that's what we should be more worried about, not to see it as a one-off. And what changes have the platforms made? And I would say not enough.
Jennifer, you've used this phrase, truth decay, in your work, and nowhere have we seen that more potently than when it comes to the pandemic and disinformation on social media and other places around the efficacy of vaccines and the efficacy of mitigation measures. And these are all things that are backed by science. They're backed by data. But as you lay out, there's declining trust in those two things. So can that decay as you lay it out? Can it be reversed?
Well, the challenge is that disinformation tends to have an emotional component. As Claire described, it's participatory. It becomes part of the believer's identity. Trying to reverse the decay, as you described it, is not simple. It's very, very challenging because you're actually having to break into people's worldview and change how they see the world. This is a challenge for a whole range of stakeholders. Social media companies are one, researchers and scientists are another. How do we make data, whether it's about vaccines or COVID or election integrity, how do we make that data, that narrative compelling to people who are not inclined to believe it? One piece of that is thinking about who provides the messages. There's a concept of strategic messengers, trusted people within communities that are vulnerable or at risk for believing conspiracies and disinformation. Election integrity is one of those cases where identifying allies within the communities that are vulnerable to that information is a challenge. And I don't think it's a challenge that has been addressed yet, which is why the conspiracies and disinformation around the 2020 election continue to thrive.
Claire, you've also done some work on this about how people can arm themselves, right? How they can outsmart misinformation or disinformation campaigns, whether it is around elections or political candidates or vaccines or the pandemic. What are some of those tactics? What should people know?
What the research shows is, whilst it's important to have fact checking, what we should be doing is actually, rather than focusing on the individual rumor or conspiracy, teaching people the tactics of those who are trying to manipulate them. Because what the research shows is, whoever you are, whatever your political persuasion or even education level, nobody wants to believe that they're being hoaxed or fooled. So the more that communities can work with each other to teach them, well, if you see a text message that says, my brother works for the government and he's telling me ... an anecdote, as Jennifer just said, that in itself, teaching people, well, just be a little bit more savvy about that, because that's a known tactic. So the more we can teach people tactics and techniques, rather than waiting for the rumor and then kind of playing whack-a-mole, we're actually seeing the research shows that's a much more effective way of building the resilience that means that when they see misinformation, they're more likely to identify it as that.
Claire, I have to ask, after all the work you've done, and Jennifer, I'll ask the same thing of you, with misinformation and disinformation so prolific, now being pronounced and perpetuated from even the highest office in the land at times, do you have hope that that can be brought back under control?
I still have hope, otherwise I wouldn't get up every day. But I think what we have to realize is this is a very long game. I'd say, this is the battle of our lives for the next 20 to 30 years around climate, elections, vaccines, health. And we need to start thinking that this is a long game. There's no quick fix. We can't just shift the Facebook algorithm and make it all go away.
Jennifer, what about you?
I agree with Claire. I think it's important to recognize that this the challenge that we face now has evolved over several decades, and it's going to take just as long to figure out a way to manage the situation. So really thinking about this as from a holistic perspective, and understanding that whatever future we work to, that's hopefully better than what we face today. It's not going to look the same as 20 or 30 years ago. The goal isn't to put the cat back in the bag. The goal is to figure out sort of what we want online spaces to look like, what we want our societies to look like, and how we want to interact in that way. And I guess that's what gives me hope, is thinking that, we can work towards that better future rather than thinking about how we make things go back to the way they were.
That is Jennifer Kavanaugh and Claire Wardle. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
On this January 6th, solemn ceremonies at the U.S. Capitol replaced the violent scenes of rioters ransacking the building 1 year ago. It was also a day when a sitting president denounced the man he succeeded in stark terms. Congressional correspondent Lisa Desjardins begins our coverage.
My fellow Americans.
Today, a speech, a location, and an anniversary, which were all unprecedented.
1 year ago today, in this sacred place, democracy was attacked.
In one of the oldest parts of the Capitol, President Biden took on the January 6th attack with his most direct confrontation yet of his predecessor.
We must be absolutely clear about what is true and what is a lie. And here's the truth. The former President of the United States of America has created and spread a web of lies about the 2020 election. He's done so because he values power over principle. He can't accept he lost.
The words echoed inside Statuary Hall, a place that was filled with pro-Trump rioters 1 year ago, a mob that wanted to stop the electoral count and the Biden win. He recounted the scene that day in historic terms.
Rioters rampaging, waving for the first time inside this Capitol Confederate flag that symbolized the cause to destroy America, to rip us apart. Even during the Civil War, that never, ever happened.
The address was unusual for President Biden, who has often resisted drawing attention to 2020 and to what's called the big lie from former President Trump about election fraud. Biden didn't mention Trump by name, but he did level very clear charges.
For the first time in our history, a president had not just lost an election, he tried to prevent the peaceful transfer of power as a violent mob breached the Capitol. But they failed. They failed. And on this day of remembrance, we must make sure that such attack never, never happens again.
We fight like hell.
Mr. Trump fomented the attack, the president said, and then let it continue.
What did we not see? We didn't see a former president who had just rallied the mob to attack, sitting in the private dining room off the Oval Office in the White House, watching it all on television and doing nothing for hours.
Former President Trump responded shortly after President Biden's remarks with several statements lashing back. He wrote, "Biden used my name to further divide America. The political theater is all just a distraction for the fact Biden has totally and completely failed." And Mr. Trump doubled down on the false claim that the election was fraudulent. That incredible divide and Mr. Trump's sway in his party were evident on the House floor.
Now I ask all members,
which met for a brief January 6th commemoration and moment of silence. Nearly no Republicans attended. But among the few who did, a very big name, former Vice President Dick Cheney. He attended with his daughter, Congresswoman Liz Cheney. Reporters asked his thoughts on how current Republican leaders have handled January 6th, sparking remarkable pushback from a top party member.
It's not a leadership that resembles any of the folks I knew when I was here for 10 years.
Cheney used to be considered among the most hard-right. But those who hold that position now, Representatives Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, showed the divide by holding their own separate news conference. All this as many members simply wanted to address the harm and their experiences from last January 6th.
I'm emotional because my memories are very similar to many of yours.
the House held an unusual event, an opportunity for members to give testimonials.
Those of us trapped in the gallery, we lived it, ducking, crawling under, over railings, hands, knees, the sounds, the smells. We had a front row seat to what lies, hate, or plain old misinformation conjures.
The January 6th committee did not meet, but has indicated it hopes for public hearings soon and a report in coming months.
And Lisa joins me now, along with our chief Washington correspondent, Jeff Bennett, who's at the White House. So, Lisa, you've been at the Capitol most of this day. Tell us a little bit more about what you're picking up there on this day of looking back.
Judy, the feeling today was reflective, and the tone was soft and quiet, to be honest. In fact, I want to show you, just ended a few minutes ago, was a vigil held by congressional leaders, mostly Democrats there, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. You know, really today seemed to me to be about an idea of healing and about members dealing with their own personal memories. Very different from what I've been experiencing in the last year, which is members talking about the greater political high stakes. Those, however, are still evident. I spoke with one Democratic senator who came to the Capitol today, told me she is determined, that January 6th makes her more determined about their agenda. All that said, Judy, I've been speaking to so many House members this week, and I have to tell you that Democrats, lawmakers that I spoke to, did not seem to have a really clear message, a real counterpunch to President Trump's false charges about January 6th, to his following. They seem to have different messages until today, when President Biden spoke, speaking to some of those same Democratic lawmakers today. They said they've heard something different than they've heard before. And one, in fact, said it was as if President Biden said what had been on his mind all along. So we'll see if that changes how Democrats act going forward.
And picking up on that, Jeff, we did hear some in Lisa's report of what President Biden had to say, but you've learned a little more about what was behind the thinking in having him deliver this message today.
That's right. And the president, as you know, has described this moment as a battle for the soul of the nation. And his remarks this morning, I'm told by sources familiar with his thinking, were an acknowledgement that really trying to unite the country starts with a forceful condemnation and a direct calling out of the forces that seek to divide us. And so for President Biden, for much of the past year, he's really tried to avoid talking at length about Donald Trump. And I'm told that's for a few reasons. One, he didn't want to try to elevate him or sort of draw more attention to the lies the former president told about the election that he lost. He also, Judy, didn't want to really personalize what he sees as being a debate that should focus on trying to defend and preserve the democracy. But really, all of that changed today. President Biden standing in that Capitol he so reveres with a top-to-bottom takedown of Trump and Trumpism. And on his way out of the Capitol, the president was asked by a reporter if his words might have done more to divide than heal. And the president shot back. He said no. He said understanding how to move forward requires an understanding of the extent of the wound. And we should also mention that this speech in many ways sets the foundation for Democrats as they move forward and try to renew their push for voting rights. There are a pair of bills that are stalled in the Senate. And so this is going to be a messaging battle that really starts with the kind of direct language we heard from the president and vice president today, Judy.
It was a noticeable turn. Jeff Bennett at the White House, Lisa Desjardins at the Capitol. Thank you both. And as we've been discussing, President Biden and Vice President Harris both spoke at the Capitol this morning to mark this anniversary of the insurrection. And that was the focus as I began my conversation with the Vice President earlier this afternoon. Madam Vice President, thank you very much for joining us. On this day, 1 year after the assault on the Capitol, you, President Biden, speaking out very forcefully on the need to correct the lies out there about what happened and to hold former President Trump accountable. But we know 1 year later, those lies have only settled in. Why do you think it is, after all this time, that attitudes have not changed?
Well, Judy, first of all, it's great to be with you. I will say, as I said in my speech this morning, that I do believe that there has been a slow attempt to unravel our democracy that proceeded 1 year ago. And it is important that we look at what happened 1 year ago on January 6th. as a moment in a series of events that have been taking place, some would argue over the last 15 years, slowly but steadily, in terms of an attempt to erode our democracy. And when I think then about where we are as of today, this is a moment where we reflect on this violent assault on our Capitol, an assault that I think in many ways symbolized what can happen if there is a destruction of democracy, meaning chaos and violence and a lack of order or adherence to rule of law. But let's also see this as a moment where the duality of the existence of a democracy that is both fragile and strong was highlighted, in that at the end of January 6th, that night 1 year ago, where I was there still as a senator and vice president-elect,
right,
members of all parties, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, went back to show their loyalty to the Constitution above party or person and uphold the tenets of our Constitution and our democracy.
But just as many people today, if not more, believe the lies about what happened. What's to stop this from just staying this way, this deep polarization for years to come?
Our democracy will not stand and it will not survive if we, each of us, is not vigilant in understanding we can take nothing about it for granted. So to your point, there have been moments in history such as this where there has been rampant misinformation, lies. And it is incumbent then on those who are informed, who are knowledgeable, to be vigilant in speaking truth, no matter how difficult sometimes it is to hear, much less speak. Because the truth is that the democracy of the United States of America is only standing as it is because of the faith and the purpose of the American people to fight for it.
Given attitudes out there, do you believe the January 6th House committee will get to the bottom of what happened?
I do. And from what I'm witnessing from the outside, it seems that they are exercising great diligence and they are being guided by the facts and law and doing their job and upholding their oath to defend and support the Constitution of the United States. I do have faith in the process that they have embarked upon, and I think we will see, I hope and I believe we will see justice come out of it.
I want to ask you about what the vice chair of that committee, Representative Liz Cheney, one of the only Republicans seeking to hold the former president accountable, said. She said former President Trump, quote, summoned this mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack. Is she right?
Yes. And again, these are moments where we must speak truth, and I applaud her courage in the midst of a number of her colleagues who have failed to show such courage, or those who have shown courage and sadly are not seeking re-election or have not sought re-election. I applaud her courage to speak truth. Yes.
But if that's the case, then does that not mean there will have to be serious consideration of a criminal prosecution?
I am not privy to the internal facts that are before that committee, so I can't speak to that. And perhaps I'm burdened by also my career as an attorney and as a prosecutor, where I'm not going to judge or speak to the facts and the law in the case, which I don't know.
Well, let me ask you about the aftermath of all this. You and President Biden are going to be speaking out more publicly in the days to come about the need for voting rights reform. But we know right now there aren't enough votes for that in the Senate. Some Republicans are countering right now with a proposal to reform the way the Electoral College vote takes place. Why is that not an acceptable compromise?
Because it's not a solution to the problem at hand, which is that right now in the United States of America, we need federal laws that guarantee the freedom and right of every American to have access to the ballot, to be able to vote. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, address that issue. And those are the issues that are present and that are imminent and that are really dispositive, frankly, of this moment in time in terms of whether we are going to fight for some of the most important pillars of a democracy, such as the freedom to vote and free and fair elections. So let us pass those two pieces of legislation and ensure through the federal law that all Americans have meaningful access to the polls.
Three other things I want to ask you about, Madam Vice President. COVID is the first. 6 of the prominent public health advisors who were part of the Biden-Harris transition team have today gone public with a plea to the president to adopt an entirely new pandemic strategy geared to what they call the new normal of living with this virus indefinitely, trying to minimize the risk.
First of all, what we know without any debate, and I think all of us agree, is that we have tools available to us to address this pandemic in a way that we can, at the very least, mitigate the harm to the greatest number of people. And so we are going to continue as an administration to urge all people who are eligible to get vaccinated, to get the booster, to wear masks when they are in public, and to do what is necessary for us to get beyond this. We welcome, of course, anyone who has information, especially those who are experts, about how we can accomplish these goals. But there are certain things that are without debate and really not even necessary for discussion at this point among people who are knowledgeable about what needs to happen in terms of vaccines and boosters and masks.
But is it time for a new approach is the question. I mean, this administration came in promising to get things on track. Here we are a year later, we're in the 4th wave. There aren't enough tests, nearly enough.
We know that the approach in terms of vaccines, boosters, and masks work. So I don't think that that's what we're discussing right now. But let's also talk about, to your point, where we are today versus a year ago. Today, the vast majority of schools are open. Today, we have a vaccine that the majority of Americans have actually received. Boosters, we are seeing great progress with that. People are wearing their masks. So we have seen progress. We are seeing businesses reopen. And I think it's important for us to see in this moment, it is extremely frustrating, there's no question, for all of us. But we also must acknowledge that there has been progress and that is the trajectory. But there are still steps to go. We have still work to do, and in particular around the vaccines and masks. We want to make sure that everyone is taking advantage of all the tools that we do have available to us right now.
2 other things. One is your administration, the Biden-Harris agenda in the beginning, a year ago, got off to a strong start, but it's obviously stalled. Right now, the president's approval ratings have taken a dramatic hit. Did you try to do too much?
Well, I think that there are many metrics by which we can measure where we are today. One of them, again, is where we are on COVID, which we just discussed. Let's also look at where we are on the economy. Last year, we created 6 million new jobs. Last year, we brought unemployment down to, I believe it was 4.2%, which the economists most didn't believe would happen until at least 2023, 2024. So we have seen great progress. We passed an infrastructure law. People have been, of both parties, as administrations have been talking about doing for generations. There has been great progress, no doubt. You know, COVID, for example, I mean, everybody is frustrated with that. And I understand, and I fully appreciate, there is a level of malaise. We're 2 years into this thing. You know, we want to get back to normal. We all do. But we have to then do the tough and hard work of pushing through with solutions, understanding that there are going to be challenges, but let's meet the challenges where they are. And let's also take a moment to see the progress we've achieved.
Last question. This year, Madam Vice President, has not been an easy one for you. There have been a rash of stories about dissension inside your office, inside the White House, about questions about your role. What would you say you've learned over this year?
Well, one of the things I've learned is to get out of D.C. I think it's important to definitely be out and be, you know, I can't tell you when I've been able to get out of D.C. and be with the folks who are actually informing our policies and will be impacted by our policies. I do hope that this year I will be able to get out there more. I know the president feels the same way, so that we can make sure that we are with the folks and not just, frankly, you know, hanging out in D.C. with the pundits.
Madam Vice President Kamala Harris, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Thank you. Happy New Year.
To help us understand the broader effects that January 6th is having on our politics, our culture, and democracy itself, and consider where we go from here, I spoke yesterday with 4 writers who've spent the last year engaged in this conversation. George Packer is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He has written extensively about the country's political divisions. Jelani Cobb covers race and politics at The New Yorker and is a professor of journalism at Columbia University. Stuart Stevens is a former Republican strategist. He worked on many Republican campaigns, including for Mitt Romney in 2012, but has since written the book, It Was All a Lie: How the Republican Party Became Donald Trump. And Gary Abernathy is a contributing columnist at The Washington Post. We welcome all 4 of you to the program. Thank you so much. Let me just lay down the basics. What words would you use, George Packer, to describe what happened on January 6th? And how much does it matter that we get to the bottom of it, that we hold those responsible accountable?
At the time, I thought it was an insurrection, and I still do, directed by the president. And I still think that, but I underestimated it. I thought it was a kind of wild shot that nearly hit its target, could have been fatal, but that we dodged. That's not how I see it now. I think it was actually a warning shot and almost a searching for the target that did miss, but that found how to get the target next time. And in the year since January 6th, what we've seen is efforts by both national Republicans and state legislatures and major figures in the party to figure out how to use January 6th to make sure that next time it works. And next time, what didn't work for Donald Trump in overthrowing the 2020 election and the Constitution last time is going to work next time. And that, for that reason, I think a year later, I'm far more concerned even than I was when I was in a state of shock on January 6, 2021.
Gary Abernathy, what about you? How do you see what happened?
Well, I think it was a very disturbing day, Judy, one of the most disturbing and embarrassing things that I've ever seen. It makes me actually angry at Donald Trump because of someone who supported Trump, and frankly, I'm still glad he was president. But I think the event disqualifies him from future office, not legally, but in the hearts of people, they should say, we can't vote for this guy again. And it's because of what he didn't do. But as president of the United States, he should have done more to tamp down the emotions of that day. And he should be held politically responsible for not doing that. I think it's a stretch to say he's legally responsible for not doing that. And I think the worry for me is going too far the other way to try to really use this politically to slam the Republican Party in a way legally that really is better adjudicated at the ballot box, so to speak.
But Jelani Cobb, how much does it matter that we understand what happened on January 6th?
And it matters. It's crucial. I can't think of anything that's more important, in fact. I agree with George. If I were to use a single word here to describe what it was, I would say harbinger. Because, at the moment, people thought that this had been averted and that the danger had passed. But in reality, if we think about, January 6th at the Capitol, there was a convergence in a single place, and that building was overwhelmed. And supposedly the most fortified, secure city in the country in terms of federal presence, and that building was overwhelmed rather easily. What would have happened if we'd had brush fires across the country in the state legislatures, as we saw in Michigan? What if people had come back, militias had come back in Michigan, in Georgia, in Arizona, in places where there was suspicion being ginned up, and how would that have played out? We could have wound up with a much, much worse situation, and there's no guarantee that we won't wind up with a similar kind of situation in the future.
Stu Stevens, you've heard what the others are saying. How do you look on what happened?
I think what's important to wrap our minds around is that what happened on 1/6 was just part of a larger effort here, which is autocratic movement in America. And I think that it's a mistake just to isolate 1/6 as okay, this one event, some people came there. Look what followed, these coordinated effort to pass these voting legislations to make it more difficult for people who don't vote Republican to vote.
And George Packer, we heard Gary Abernathy say in so many words that it would be wrong to overinterpret, overreact to what happened. What do you think about that?
How can one overreact to a mortal threat to American democracy? The first in my lifetime that actually seems to be on a road toward making it impossible for the popular will to be respected at the ballot box. That's been the goal of all these bills passed or debated across legislatures in Georgia, in Arizona, in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, which are not just about restricting access to the ballot, but are about putting elections in the hands of reliable partisans so that next time around we'll have states that claim that the election was somehow wrongly held and that it's thrown into the hands of a partisan legislature which sends its own electors to Congress to choose the next president. That's exactly the strategy going on right now, and it's building on what the Republican Party learned from 1/6 and these events around it, which was you need the right people in the right offices to be making these decisions in order to seize power. They didn't have it last time. They're trying to get it next time. I can't possibly overestimate the seriousness of that.
Gary Abernathy, you're hearing this. You're hearing George and the others say it's impossible not to take this seriously.
I want to be clear. I'm on board with everyone who thinks January 6th was a horrible day for our country. I think it's right to remember it. I think it's right to look back at it as a day that we should all be ashamed of and hope never repeats itself. But I think it's being used politically in some cases to then, extrapolate those events and say, well, we can't have any election reform, we can't have anything because it's all an effort to make what happened on January 6th happen again. And the fact is, a lot of us would argue that our system actually worked on January 6th. None of these terrible things came to be because, people like Mike Pence said, I can't go along with that. So there are degrees of differences here, but in some ways, I think we're on the same page.
We are not on the same page, Gary. And the system did not work if we think about the law enforcement officers, the Capitol police officers who lost their lives. The officer who died on that day and those who subsequently died who have left. We can't gloss this over and make it seem as if it were Florida in 2000, where there were a simple bit of electoral glitches that were resolved administratively and bureaucratically. That's not what happened. We had people physically beating police officers and threatening to lynch the sitting vice president of the United States. None of those are minor things.
I want to move and bring in Stu Stevens again and talk about the role of the political parties. The Republican Party in this, we know most Republicans today say they believe Donald Trump was reelected, that Joe Biden is not legitimately the president.
When we say that the majority of Republicans don't believe that Joe Biden is a legally elected president, that means the majority of Republicans in this country don't believe we live in a democracy. They think that we live in an occupied country. And if you follow that to a logical conclusion, it means not only do they have a right to reinstate the rightful president of the United States, some feel they have an obligation. And that's what they're going to teach their children. And if you go down that line of thinking, it justifies terrible acts of violence and terrible acts of legal authorities and legislatures to try to overturn the will of the people. We've never been here, at least not since 1860.
George Packer, what about the future? How do we keep this democracy strong with this deep division existing in our political body?
I mean, the lesson that I've learned over the past year is that democracy actually depends on a kind of reason obtaining among the electorate, people behaving in at least a roughly rational way and not falling under the spell of conspiracy thinking and irrational interpretations of events and the spell of an authoritarian demagogue like Donald Trump. But what's happened is one of our two major parties has fallen into that. It really is simply a matter of each and every American citizen finding it in themselves to resist that force and to try to rescue the democracy that we love from our fellow citizens who seem determined to take it into a direction that I think is dark and destructive, and that I fear very much.
Gary Abernathy, do you see from where you sit politically a way through this that keeps our democracy strong?
Well, and one thing I constantly try to argue for is, Judy, we need to respect each other again. We need to respect each other's differences again. I don't care what polls you look at. If you look at polls that say 40% of Americans and 80% or 90% of Republicans think that the election was stolen, we can't suddenly just demonize and minimize these people as the Americans that they are. We've got to work our way through this, talk our way through this, not just divide into our media camps and our feeds that just reinforce what we believe. We've got to do a good job of continuing to communicate, and eventually truth wins out.
Stu Stevens, do you see that as the way through?
I think that's a fantasy. You can't negotiate with evil. How do you negotiate with the person who's in the capital of the United States in a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt? You don't want to meet those people halfway. You don't need to understand them. They're wrong. People who believe in democracy are right. The solution to this is pretty straightforward. You have to beat these Republicans. You have to have more days like January 5th last year where you elect Democrats in Georgia. Because the Democratic Party, which I spent 30 years pointing out flaws in, is the party that represents democracy in America now. And we have to just accept that and put these other differences aside.
Well, it is a conversation we need to continue to have as the American people. And I want to thank all four of you for being part of this conversation today. Stu Stevens, Gary Abernathy, Jelani Cobb, George Packer, thank you so much. With the one-year anniversary of the Capitol insurrection, with a renewed push on voting rights, and with vaccine mandates getting their day in court, it has been a full week. To consider it all, we're joined by Brooks and Capehart, that is New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, columnist for the Washington Post. Very good to see both of you, even though you're not here in the studio. I was going to start with something else, but I have to begin with January the 6th, Jonathan, listening to what our correspondents were saying and thinking about what President Biden yesterday said, taking it right to his predecessor, saying that former President Trump was holding a dagger at the throat of our democracy. That's a stunning statement. What do we make of that?
It's a stunning statement, Judy, and it is a true statement. You know, the thing to keep in mind about President Biden is that he is, since the campaign, he has never been more clear, focused, direct, passionate, and determined than when he is talking about American democracy, or as he called it, the soul of America, and the damage and danger that Donald Trump was to both. He started his campaign in talking about Charlottesville and why that animated him to jump into the 2020 race. And then there in Statuary Hall as President of the United States, with, to his mind, the clear and present danger of Donald Trump and what he did as president and what he could do down the road if he decides to run for president in 2024. I think the president, after almost a year in office of getting some legislative wins under his belt, decided that the anniversary of the most dangerous moment in history for Congress, that was the time to say clearly and forcefully that what happened in that building was a travesty, and that he's going to do everything that he possibly can to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And the first step in that is talking about it, naming names, and trying to hold them publicly accountable for what they did.
And David, what do you make of President Biden using this stark imagery, hold a dagger?
Yeah, I thought the president was right to not talk about Trump directly for most of this past year, because there was the hope that Trump would fade away. And I must say, on January 7th of last year, I thought the events of January 6th were so horrific and so disgusting that it would be an inflection point and people would look at the whole Trump era as something lamentable and terrible. I was wrong about that. Donald Trump has not faded away. He's, if anything, stronger in the Republican Party. So if Donald Trump's not going to fade away, you might as well tell the truth. And you might as well go after him directly. And you might as well go after him with the passion of a man who worked for 30 years, more than 30 years, in that building. And who mentioned yesterday that the rotunda where they were sitting, that's where Abraham Lincoln sat. That's, a few feet down the hallway, there's John F. Kennedy. A few feet down the other hallway, there's Tip O'Neill. And so this is American history that was trampled, something Joe Biden has devoted his life to extending and making prosperous. So there's got to be strong emotions there, and I'm glad he expressed them.
And Jonathan, I mean, as you're pointing out, as David's pointing out, this is a turn for President Biden. He hasn't wanted or hasn't spent a lot of time talking directly about the former president, but now he's going after him. Is there a risk in that?
There are risks in everything, but I think that the president and the White House have made the calculation that if you're going to take any kind of risk, if the risk is in defending American democracy, then it is a risk worth taking. And I think that the president, the speech yesterday was terrific. It was what the nation needed to hear, but it can't be the last step. It has to be the first step of many to remind people about what happened, who did it, and also to remind people that even though the focus right now is on Donald Trump, what Donald Trump unleashed will survive Donald Trump, whether he runs for president or not. And that is the big danger that I think a lot of people are might be getting themselves into by focusing so intensely on Donald Trump and the damage he did to this country, that they're maybe not paying attention to the forces that he unleashed that can't be put back in the bottle now that they have been unleashed.
David, pick up on that. I mean, how is it a gamble for President Biden to be taking this tack right now in his presidency?
I don't think so. The Democrats criticizing Donald Trump is not exactly a new thing. It's not exactly a risky thing for Democrats. To take it down a notch to the crass political level, the Democrats are going to try to keep their majorities in 2022. Joe Biden presumably is going to try to keep the presidency, or at least have a Democrat in the presidency in 2024. His approval ratings are not high enough to do that on the basis of his own accomplishments. And frankly, he didn't win the presidency the first time because people love Joe Biden. He won it because people really dislike Donald Trump. And so raising the saliency of Trump is probably the smart thing to do. Now, there are clear limits to that, as we learned in the Virginia gubernatorial race, when the Democrats tried to tie Youngkin to Trump, and it didn't work. So I don't think it's the only thing he can do to keep Democrats in office, but it's certainly a key part of it.
Well, one of the things we're seeing the president and the vice president do, they're heading to Atlanta, Jonathan, next week to make what they're calling major speech or statement on voting rights, a big push for legislation that they have not been able to get through Congress. Meantime, some Republicans, and I know you all talked about this a little bit last week, but meantime, Republicans are coming back and saying, well, let's look at electoral vote count reform. I asked Vice President Harris about that when I had a chance to talk to her yesterday. Here's what she had to say about how to think about these two things.
It's not a solution to the problem at hand, which is that right now in the United States of America, we need federal laws that guarantee the freedom and right of every American to have access to the ballot, to be able to vote. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, address that issue. And those are the issues that are present and that are imminent.
So, Jonathan, she's saying voting rights has to come before anything with the electoral vote count.
Well, because as she was saying, what is happening in the states is happening because of the big lie, suppressing the vote, keeping people from voting. And also now the prospect of once people have voted, boards of elections that have now been taken over by state legislatures having their votes tossed out. So that's why there's this big push for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to be passed, for the Freedom to Vote Act to be passed. But I also think in your interview with the vice president, I think she goes on to say that it's not an either or. Both of these things have to be done. It's a matter of priority. And when it comes to the Electoral Count, the Electoral Count Act, Congressman Jamie Raskin, who's a member of the January 6th Select Committee, writes in his new book, Unthinkable, about how they saw months, by May of 2020, that the Electoral Count Act was probably the way that Donald Trump was going to try to mess with the election because it was so squishy. So the Electoral Count Act must be reformed, but doing that instead of passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act or the Freedom to Vote Act, that's not a solution to the near-term danger that faces the right to vote right now.
David, how do you see movement on these two things, or not?
Well, I think we probably need to do both, but I really do think the Democrats have to completely revamp their approach to the national emergency January 6th started, or Donald Trump started, and is continuing expanding right to this day. There are sort of three elements to an election. There's casting the votes, there's counting the votes, and then there's certifying the results. We do not have a crisis in casting the votes. We just in 2020 had the highest vote turnout in American history. We don't have at all a problem in counting the votes. We counted the votes without fraud and without error pretty much in 2020, as we've seen. We have a complete crisis in the certification of the votes. It's that third thing where we have the complete crisis where state legislatures are politicizing the vote certification, where they're attacking the people who bravely stood up to Donald Trump, where Republicans are running for these local judge of elections positions, Republicans who are Trumpy and presumably use them for nefarious ends. And so we have this massive assault on our democracy in the certification of the results. The problem with the Freedom to Vote Act is it has very little about that. It's all about elements 1 and 2. And so to me, what the Democrats need to do is really focus on the certification, protecting the people who are nonpartisan in certifying results. The Democrats need to get much more active locally on these local races for judge of elections and all those other things. And they're not doing that. The Republicans are far outpacing them on the ground and on the grassroots. And so me, the House is on fire on that. And so we should be focusing on that and take care of that immediately. And then we can do the other voting rights, which are very hard to pass. We can do it now or we can do it later, but we need to focus on that third thing.
Jonathan, what about that?
I agree with David that the House is on fire, but I don't agree with David. And David mentions this, has mentioned this at least 3 times about how there's no, the vote is not being suppressed. There are a lot of Democratic and progressive activists and actual voters who would disagree with that, especially those who are standing in line for hours and hours in multiple locations, multiple states in order to vote. But look, all of these things that we are talking about need to be addressed. The only problem is we don't live in a monarchy and we don't live in a dictatorship where President Biden, King Biden, Dictator Biden can just go and say this shall be done. What the Senate needs to do is to take action to ensure that whoever wants to register to vote can vote, that the person who registers to vote is able to vote as conveniently as possible. And then when that person does vote, that their vote actually gets counted and that their voice is actually heard by not having a state board overturn the voice of the people, the will of the people at the ballot box. That has to be done, and that can only be done at this point if the United States Senate rallies around and gets it done. But unfortunately, we spend a lot of our time talking about 2 senators, one in particular, who still, even though the House is on fire, is refusing to be a part of the solution to put the fire out.
David, put the button on this. Why isn't that the priority? You've got 30 seconds.
I don't think the answer is in Washington. Democrats need to rally people in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and state capitals around the country. They need to work on state legislators. They need to make it extremely painful for anybody to vote to politicize the certification of a result. I think the focus on Washington is the wrong focus right now. And the Republicans know this, and they're doing something about it, and Democrats are not.
Clarion call from each one of you, David Brooks, Jonathan Capehart. Thank you both on this Friday night. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you, Judy.
We return to some familiar faces, our own NewsHour correspondents who were on duty covering the events of January 6th. Lisa Desjardins, who was inside the Capitol, Amna Nawaz, who was outside the building as the crowd gathered, and Yamiche Alcindor, who was at the White House. The four of us spoke last year in the days following the insurrection for our podcast, America Interrupted. And when we came together again earlier this week, we talked about how the country has changed in the year since. Lisa, let me start with you. You were inside the Capitol. I remember it vividly as the rioters broke through the glass in those doors. You were eyewitness to the worst attack on the U.S. Capitol in 200 years. From a political standpoint, Lisa, it looks like a much more partisan place. What does it feel like from the inside?
I didn't think that the Capitol could get more partisan than after the 2020 election ended in 2020, but it has. And I also have to say, a year ago, we all felt these palpable, very raw emotions from lawmakers right after January 6th, and I knew they would continue. I thought they would continue February, March, April. Democrats just seething with anger. Democrats who don't usually express this kind of anger were saying things like this to me, that they couldn't look at Republicans, couldn't even get in an elevator with some of the Republicans who had objected to the election. I was sure that that would wane by the end of the summer. And I have to say, it really didn't. It continued through the fall as we saw some Republicans increase their rhetoric on the other side. I will say just this one holiday break, this past holiday break, I have sensed in my phone calls with lawmakers, finally a little bit of breathing and a little bit of relaxing of that anger. But I just don't know what's going to happen when they return to Washington.
Interesting. And Yamiche, you were at the White House. You were on the lawn as all this was unfolding at the Capitol. You were trying to stay in contact with then Trump administration officials on the inside. How has our understanding of what then President Trump was doing during all this, how has that evolved and changed over the last year?
Well, Judy, I do remember standing on the White House lawn and watching people break into the U.S. Capitol. The president was watching it all unfold on TV like so many other Americans. And he was in some ways both enjoying the idea that his supporters had taken his lie about the election being stolen so seriously that they were breaking into the Capitol to sort of defend his line, his idea of what should be happening in this moment. But he was also in some ways fearful because there was real violence happening. The president's lie has metastasized. It's grown all across the GOP. And now you have GOP lawmakers, elected officials who at first were outraged, who at first were telling me that the president had gone too far. They've now all sort of fallen in line. So the president, former president, has continued to lie about the election, continued to say that the election was stolen, and his power that seemed to be teetering, that seemed to be almost coming to an end on January 6th, it's only grown and grown.
And then, Amna, you were outside the Capitol. You were talking to the protesters and others outside, watching as all this unfolded. Recollect for us some of the language you were hearing from them and talk about how that's evolved in the years since.
Judy, in terms of everyone we talked to outside that day, there was one thing everyone had in common, and that was that they believed the election lie. They believed that the election had been stolen. Beyond that, in terms of rhetoric, it was really a mishmash. I mean, there were conspiracy theorists out there waving QAnon flags. There were anti-vaxxers and COVID deniers who harassed me and our team for wearing masks out there. There were far-right extremists. There were white nationalists, white supremacists, openly wearing the insignias of these groups and walking around. And it was this overlapping, this sort of toxic brew of ideological beliefs and personal grievances that really caught a lot of people by surprise and caught a lot of national security and counterterrorism experts by surprise at the time, too. They hadn't seen it before. Well, how much has that changed in the years since? not much, if anything, it's gotten worse. I mean, we know the potency of that election lie that millions of people still believe. We know where we are with anti-vaxxers and COVID deniers. And we also know where we are with the larger threat to the U.S. from some of those groups. Those blending of beliefs, experts say, is more volatile than ever. You know, the top two lethal threats, domestic threats to the U.S. today, are violent white supremacists and anti-government extremists. And those remain the top concerns for counterterrorism officials.
And in terms of holding people accountable, we've seen over 700 people arrested, charged in connection with the assault on the Capitol. Lisa, you have a firsthand connection with all of this. What is it? 2 of the people who were following you inside the Capitol have been sentenced in the last week or so.
That's right. And you know, Judy, I didn't know that I was being followed until this summer when the Department of Justice contacted me and said, we see on video that 2 of the rioters followed you for a significant distance. Those two men from Pennsylvania were just sentenced this week, and their attorneys were both asking that they be given no more than 1 day in jail. This was their first offense for both of them. Neither of them harmed anyone when they were in their building. They did pick up some papers, some congressional papers at some point, and put them down. And that is one of the things the judge said was serious. The judge did give them 30 days in jail, which was a disappointment to their attorneys. But the judge said, it is not enough to say that you just wandered into the building, or you didn't mean to be there, or you wish you could have left, or that you regret it. The judge was very strong and said, this was an attack on our democracy, and I cannot condone this kind of mob violence.
Some of the language we heard from these rioters that day, clearly there were racist elements to it. Yamiche, we've talked over the past year about how that language has persisted and how it's played into what was already a fraught controversy, conflict in our nation, across our nation, over racial justice. How do you see that coming together a year later?
Well, a year later, the language that we saw used at this attack on the Capitol has sort of spread and deepened across our country. We've seen really an evolving of the conversation on race, where we saw, of course, the murder of George Floyd and this swelling of this idea that America really needed to be better when it came to not only policing Americans, but also the way that we talk about justice and race. And there's been a big backlash to that movement. And what we've seen really is that January 6th was not the end of something, but it was really the beginning of this ugly phase. So we've really seen a lot of people, I think, twisting the idea of pushing for racial equality in this country and making excuses, frankly, for the people who broke into the Capitol. And that has been detrimental, I think, to our democracy. And that continues to be the case.
And Amna, I want you to pick up on that, because this notion of how we use language with racist overtones and just arguments over what word to use about what happened on January the 6th, the words to use, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's insurrection versus a coup. All of these things have not only been, they've filtered out into the public discourse, but they're things that journalists have had to think about.
That's absolutely right, Judy. I think it's important to point out that some of those forces that we confronted face to face that day on the Capitol grounds have always represented some of the biggest threats to people of color and to marginalized people in this country. And it was a mostly white crowd who had openly talked about bringing violence to the Capitol that day, who authorities did not see as a threat, who felt entitled to storm a federal property and try to overturn a democratic process because they were angry. And I think we've all done this long enough to know what that response would have been if that had been a crowd of all Black people or all brown people or all Muslim people or all immigrants. And this kind of organized eruption really laid bare what so many of us have long known and lived, which is that white anger is seen differently here.
I want to close by asking each one of you to think about what stays with you, what sticks in your mind as you go back and you think about that day. Lisa?
I think one that stays with me, this is going to sound so corny, there are 2 things. It's just the walking away from the Capitol that night. We were there till 3, 4 in the morning for the election to finish, and it was so important for all of us to stay there. And I think of that image, sorry. And it was I just have such faith in the Capitol. Sorry, I'm getting emotional.
Yeah. 1 year later.
I think I just had, it's a beautiful place. And I really, walking away from the Capitol that night, looking at it, I just remember that feeling of faith in our Constitution and in that building. And one more thing, someone loaned me a phone charger at a critical moment, and that is something I will always hold on to. It is my lucky phone charger.
And Yamiche, for you, what memory stays most with you?
The memory that sticks most with me watching the Capitol being attacked is that sense of entitlement that these white protesters had to break in. And I kept picturing what it might have been like had these people been the protesters that I covered so closely in Ferguson, the Black people that were demanding justice and police accountability. It's very easy to see those people being shot, frankly, dead on the steps of the Capitol if they were Black or brown or immigrants. And to see some of the white protesters walk away with their lives, I think it's something that sticks with me because to me, it taught a lesson of who could be outraged, who could break into the Capitol and keep their lives, and who are the people who, if they stand peacefully on a street and demand justice, they might die just for asking peacefully for respect.
And finally, Amna, what stays with you?
Well, Judy, as you know, I spent years as a war correspondent, a conflict reporter overseas, parachuting in and out of places where, quite frankly, scenes like this were expected. And I said on the day, and it is still true, that I never expected to see that scene unfold in my own home country, but also on the steps of the U.S. Capitol. And I think what last year has shown me is that while America is absolutely unique as a nation with its democracy, it is not immune from a lot of those same forces that can wear away and tear away and eat away at foundational parts of our democracy. And that includes journalism, right? A free and fair press. So I think what I carry with me, what sticks with me is really just this sense of duty to continue to not just report on everything we see and to bear witness, but also to remind people about what's at stake.
Well, the three of you were absolutely essential to the NewsHour's reporting on that tragic and historic day in America. So we cannot thank you enough for what you did on that day and the reporting ever since, and of course, right up until right now. So I want to thank you, Lisa Desjardins, Amna Nawaz, and Yamiche Alcindor. This is your last program as a NewsHour correspondent, White House correspondent. You are leaving us to go on to NBC News. We wish you the very best. We're going to miss you. You've contributed so much to the work of this program, but we will miss you, and we thank you, all three.
Thank you so much, Judy. It's been an honor to work and report with you and so many others on this program.
Thank you. Thank you all.
1 year ago, supporters of President Donald Trump breached the United States Capitol building in an attempt to disrupt the democratic process. Lawmakers, staffers, maintenance workers, Capitol police officers, and many others feared for their lives as insurrectionists trampled barriers, shattered windows, and broke into the Capitol. And as a predominantly white crowd shouted racist epithets and threatened lawmakers, there was a particular concern that people of color would be targeted by the violence. I spoke with Representatives Sheila Jackson Lee, Grace Ming, and Norma Torres, all Congresswomen of color who were trapped in the Capitol that day. I want to start off by asking you, where were you on January 6th, 2021? What happened and how did you navigate that?
We were looking forward to watching democracy, unfold as we began to go through, this process of certifying the election results that had already been certified by all states. So, it started as, for me, getting those alerts, those text alerts on my phone. I noticed that of my colleagues, not all of them were receiving those text alerts. So I was sharing that information with them. Really going through the process of, one building after another being breached by these rioters that were attacking us. And it got to a point where I thought, we're going to be here for a long time. I never imagined they would breach the Capitol itself, but also the doors of the balcony where I was sitting, balcony number 3. At one point, the door swung open, and it was an officer in plain clothes that had been shoved in. And he had been shoved in so hard that he almost lost his balance. A cell phone was dropped. Immediately, he shoved back. And I don't know what that was, that first exchange was, but I know that it was a violent exchange. The doors were closed, locked. Then he came back and picked up a phone. And the members at this point were all watching the floor, hadn't really understood what happened.
So I heard a lot of loud noises. I wasn't exactly sure what was going on. The room that we were in had no windows. And so what I did, which I later regretted, was turned on the television. And I turned on the television and I saw images of people marching and banging things. And I realized by seeing the images that they were right outside of our room, which made me more nervous because the sounds were muffled, even though they were loud. So I didn't exactly know where they were, but seeing it on TV made me realize that they were right outside of our door. So we started moving furniture and blockading the doors whatever way we could. At about the same time, I was texting with my staff the entire time because we didn't want to talk on the phone. I didn't want anyone to hear me from the outside. We had the TV on mute, and I was texting with my staff, and they said something about how people in the chamber, in the House chamber, had been instructed to put on their gas masks. So I looked around the room where we were in and couldn't find any gas masks. So we also prepared to wet the curtains in the room. There were curtains on fake windows. They're not real windows. They're just like for decoration. And so we got these curtains and we were prepared to wet them because we were told that they could be used as a good substitute in case of tear gas being used.
And then there was sounds like, lock the doors, lock the doors, lock the doors. And it was a sound that one had never heard. The last time that it happened, it was the 1950s, and it was attacks inside the chamber by individuals who were nationalists. But it had not happened in the last 50 to 70 years, at least, or at least between 50 and 70 years. And here we were being told to lock the doors, and there was a matter of confusion. But we began to, as members, look out for each other, but embrace the call to get down, get down, get down. And literally we were crawling in order to make our way to an exit that the Capitol Police could assist us, still not knowing what was going on, still literally grabbing our belongings until there was a point where I was crawling and bending down with a lot of scurrying going on, but bending down, checking on our colleagues in front of us, checking on them in back of us. I just left things on the floor. I dropped a notebook and a shawl and things that would keep your hands occupied. I kept a phone because as news was breaking, the phone began ringing. And we made it to a point of an exit, but we were still couldn't move. It was not safe enough, according to the Capitol Police, for us to move. There was slight crying. I think I was astonished. I had been in the Capitol, actually in the Capitol on 9/11. Again, I was actually in the Capitol.
hearing gunshots in the US Capitol is not normal. Hearing tear gas being deployed and seeing the smoke rise isn't normal. Seeing a mob violently attacking officers, hitting them with a US flag isn't normal. And every single person that works in the US Capitol has been impacted one way or another.
People were shocked to see insurrectionists carrying the Confederate flag and shouting racial slurs at Capitol police officers. And there are even photographs of some wearing shirts with anti-Semitic slogans on them. I'm curious to hear, how did your race and gender factor into your concerns for your own well-being that day?
As a Latina, as a female of color, we knew that we were going to, at that moment, that we thought we were going to have to fight for our lives to get out of there. And as I looked around and I saw these two brave members of Congress, two females trying to stand at the door. Mickey was one of them. Spanberger was another, getting themselves armed with a pen. We had pens. Those were our weapons, that we had to prepare ourselves. But thinking about when those doors are open and this violent crowd walks in, who are they going to unleash their, madness on first? Who would be the first that they grab? How are we going to protect ourselves up here?
I thought about that a lot because I was afraid that they would find me. And I was afraid that just based on how I looked, that they would assume that I was not, let's say, a fan of President Trump. And I was nervous how they would react if I did happen to encounter them. So my thinking at the time was just to do everything I could to avoid that situation from happening. We just turned off the lights, turned off the sound, muted turned off the sound on our cell phones, and still, texting my staff, like asking the Capitol Police to come rescue us. So yeah, we were really nervous and just desperately hoping and waiting for the Capitol Police or someone to help us get out of there. But for a brief period of time, I was worried that I wouldn't, make it.
We did not have all the exterior exhibitions of hatefulness that occurred that we saw after the fact. I would only say that I viewed myself as an American and as a patriot. That's why I was there, to see America in her best in the transition of power. I think if I felt any extra danger, it was that the color of your skin always draws more angst and anger. And if there was a situation where we were fleeing and there were people chasing us, I might have had an intensity of fear for what they would do to me if I was captured. But I was equally concerned about my brothers and sisters who were there, who did not look like me. But in this instance, the hurt was that these were Americans, domestic terrorists, insurrectionists attacking this democracy that belonged to all of us. And so it was only after when I knew and met the police officers, African-American in particular, who indicated the racial epithets that were thrown against them or towards them or said to them. And then the noose that was hanging that was supposed to be for Vice President Pence. A noose has always been a terrorist weapon because it's always terrorized people. And a hanging is one of the most vile ways of dying. And terrorists, foreign terrorists, use hangings and beheadings because it's so vile. And so to have a noose hung out on the outward area of the United States Capitol. I don't know if history reflects whether there was ever a noose. Was anyone ever hung on the grounds of the United States Capitol? Then this noose certainly had to be the first ugly sign of the stigma of race, hatefulness, racism.
Since January 6th, we've seen violent threats against other women lawmakers of color, most notably Representative Boebert's message to Representative Omar and Representative Gosar's sharing a video of fantasies about the death of Representative Ocasio-Cortez. Do instances like that make you question whether or not the right to feel safe while representing your constituents and being in the People's House is equitably applied?
Nothing about being a member of Congress from different regions, of the country is equitable. When you think about, just the cost of living, for example, but what we go through and what our colleagues think about, members that come from, let's say, California, because it is a very progressive state, it is so easy for them to, dehumanize members of color, females. It is so easy because people allow it, by staying silent. That silence from their constituents is a message to me that it is okay for their member of Congress to attack somebody that looks like me simply because I look the way I look, simply because of the color of my skin. And that's not acceptable. That is not the America, that I grew up, loving. Being an immigrant and, thinking about the sacrifices of my parents sending me to the US to escape the same type of violence that was brought upon the US Capitol on January 6th. That is the political violence that my parents wanted, so much for me to get away from. Little did I know that, I would, eventually have an opportunity to be a member of Congress, represent my community. My community, by the way, that is 70% Latino. I go there, because, they empower me to be there, and I have to be able to do my job. Members of Congress cannot be intimidated, to go on the floor and speak about the issues that are important to their constituents. My constituents are not necessarily interested in another welfare program, but they really need services. They're minimum wage workers, and just because they can't afford to buy the luxury things that many of my colleagues have and take for granted, doesn't make them any less human.
It's just, it has been really disappointing. I mean, most people on both sides of the aisle, we sacrifice a lot with our families and our personal time, and that's fine. We don't mind the hard work. We really believe that we are trying to improve the lives of people in our district. But I don't believe that, we signed up for a job where our lives should be at risk. I know that many of us are much more careful at doing and participating in very public events with large crowds. It's something that I'm much more mindful of than in the past. And so it's definitely something that is scary. I mean, my mom has asked me repeatedly, why I can't find another job, perhaps a safer job to help people in similar ways. So people are definitely very nervous, and it's really upsetting to see when our fellow colleagues, even though they're on the opposite sides of the aisle, I consider them my colleagues and never want to put any one of my colleagues or their loved ones in danger of any kind. And to see that sort of behavior come from just a few of our colleagues is just really disturbing. It's not something that is appropriate at all in any workplace, much less the People's House.
Well, I was outraged as a woman of color, on the attacks of Congressman Omar and the acts of violence that happened against my colleague from New York as well, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, was simply tragic and horrific. There is no response to it. But as someone who I think can look over the time that I've served and the ugliness that has come towards me and the attacks and the impeachment proceedings that I participated in, and the vile attacks during that period, one way or the other, I really stay focused on service. And I don't hesitate to say what I think is right on behalf of my constituents and the American people because of the color of my skin. I think I really want to focus on how unique January 6th was, and how in all of my career, even 9/11, which brought people together, brought members of Congress together, brought America together, we had a common enemy against us, how different it was for January 6th. And so on January 6th, I think what is most frightening is the ripping away, the tearing away, the fragility of democracy, and that there are persons who took the oath who would now want to kill me maybe, or my colleagues.
A big part of your job and the responsibility that your constituents have invested in you to take on requires you to go back to the Capitol. How does it feel going back there, and how have you navigated being back in a place where you experienced a life-threatening and life-changing traumatic experience?
I do not feel safe. I have an extra change of clothes, which was suggested to me by friends in law enforcement, that I should have a change of clothes and at any moment be prepared to remove my pin and try to blend in. But how do you blend in a crowd when you look like me? I can't. You can't just blend in. It doesn't matter how many hoodies I put over my head. I am still, a Latina. I am still, someone who comes from California, who lives in the city of Pomona. I can't change who I am. I think the metal detectors have given me a little bit of relief because I know that every member has to go through it. I have a vest, also a bulletproof vest in my office that I keep there. We have gone through with my staff as to, what are the emergency procedures in our office, locking the doors, barricading ourselves in our office. These are things that, we have taken for granted. These are the freedoms that are guaranteed by our Constitution. And these are freedoms that are no longer guaranteed to members of Congress because of the threat that we have within our U.S. Capitol.
I think there's just, a lot of resentment and hostility, even if we don't talk about it every day, walking past the very glass doors and windows where shots were fired and people were destroying property. It's just, there's such a sense for me of a violation of democracy and our workplace. The Capitol is a place where even the youngest of children understand somehow and get a sense that it's a sacred place. They whisper, right? They behave and act very quietly and respectfully. There's just a sense that this is a place that belongs to everyone in a physical sense, in an emotional sense, in the true spirit of what Congress and what the Capitol means to so many people across America and across the country. And so to be there and to be reminded of what happened on that day, it really just seems like such a violation of the basic foundation of our country and democracy.
How do you assess whether or not it's worth it to take those risks to hold public office?
To be honest, those thoughts have crossed through my mind more often in recent years than in the past before January 6th. But I think that serving in a time of COVID, serving in a time where in New York, for example, we had many people affected by the flooding of Hurricane Ida, I really feel like there's a place and a role for me and so many to serve and to make that sacrifice and to help bridge a lot of the gaps that aren't necessarily being met between government and the everyday people in our communities. The services and the resources that government is providing, and even those that are not being provided, have not fully reached the people in our districts and in our communities. And I feel like the risk is worth it because I think that I can continue to try to bridge that gap and to make sure that more people are getting more services from our government that they so desperately need and deserve.
I'll be darned if I'm going to allow evil forces to chase me out of something I love. One, this country. And I believe I need to stay here as long as I can to bring her back to her higher angels and values. Even when I came to the United States Congress, there were obviously two parties. There were other political interests. But we found a way to disagree and not be disagreeable, but most of all, to not be violent.
Having gone through January 6th gives me a reason to go back because my life is worth a great deal to the people that love me, but my democracy in my country is a great deal to all Americans. And I think that we have to, this is our sacrifice of this time, to continue to push forward, to be able to deliver for the people that have been suffering for so long, that have not been heard. Being that voice for them is what keeps me going.
We're going to keep telling stories like this. For more of our coverage of January 6th, head to pbs.org/newshour. I'm Nicole Ellis. Thank you for watching.